Chapter 23:37. Tens of thousands of years passed unknowingly after this tribulation where the chaos creatures cleaned up the world. During these tens of thousands of years, the world recovered from the tribulation with great difficulty. The living beings in the world recovered to the level before the great tribulation with great difficulty. The cultivation standard of the cultivation world also slowly approached the level before the tribulation during these tens of thousands of years. However, due to the pressure from the repeated tribulations, the world still maintained its order during the tribulations. In other words, it was more or less unified in order. As for the 3,000 cultivators, they had also recovered from their previous state of leadership. As for the positions that were vacated by the deaths of the tribulations, they were replenished over the tens of thousands of years. It was not those cultivators who had reincarnated, but some cultivators who were selected from other cultivators to make up for the original 3,000 cultivators. The reason for this was actually very simple. During the tribulations, they discovered that the 3,000 cultivators jointly decided the situation of the entire world. This structure took into account both efficiency and correctness, and it was the most suitable structure in their opinion. Under such circumstances, this structure was naturally replenished. From the huge loss of living beings to the number of living beings before the tribulation, one could imagine the number of new living beings. For the living beings who had survived, they finally understood how the survivors felt when they looked at them after the last tribulation. How naive! How are they going to deal with the next tribulation? Such thoughts involuntarily appeared in the minds of many living beings. It made them feel all sorts of indescribable impulses, the urge to tear apart the truth of the world right in front of them. For a time, all sorts of absurd legends began to spread in the world. These legends told of the many tribulations that the world had encountered in all sorts of specious, yet terrifying ways. Listening to these legends, the newly born living beings were only shocked and proud of the history of the world. They did not feel any bone-chilling pain because of it, which made the survivors feel helpless. However, it was also because the next tribulation was still far away that the alliance led by the 3,000 cultivators did not react to it. They only did their best to make some preparations in the dark. In this way, this part of the world seemed to be extraordinarily peaceful. Just by looking at the state of this world right now, it was impossible for anyone to imagine that a tribulation was hanging over this world's head and could descend at any moment. And it was even more impossible for them to know that this world was about to be reborn amidst all these tribulations. Of course, order was a whole, and the situation might not necessarily be the same when it came to the individual parts. Chaos was occurring everywhere in the world. Occasionally, some destructive geniuses would be born somewhere in the world. After these geniuses were born, they seemed to be self-taught. They quickly grasped inconceivable abilities and obtained unimaginable power. Then, they began to destroy everything they saw without any purpose. After causing great or small losses, they were annihilated one by one, erased one by one. Similar things were happening all over the world. Apart from the fact that they were extremely similar, there were no other factors that could be linked to each other. After discovering this, the 3,000 cultivators, who were the rulers of the world, began to believe the information that they had obtained from the cultivation method. It was precisely because of this that they were so proactive in preparing for the 80,000-year period mentioned in the cultivation method. On this day, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, felt his heart tremble. He faintly felt that there seemed to be some strange existence appearing at the boundary of this world. I sensed something. At this moment, he could not help but feel inexplicably surprised. After all, his position in this world was rather awkward. Not only was he the target of this world, but he was also the target of the world's tribulations. It could be said that, to him, everything in this world was his enemy. Under such circumstances, how could he suddenly sense something in this world? With a thought, his eyes narrowed. His gaze pierced through the endless obstacles and arrived at the place where he sensed something. This place was the boundary between the world and the state of chaos. Or rather, It was the boundary between this world and the state of chaos that was simulated by the Great Tribulation. The scenery at this boundary didn't seem much different from when the Great Emperor came. It was still the same strange scene where time and space were extremely distorted. Perhaps the Great Emperor couldn't see through this, but Luo Fan was different. His knowledge, eyesight, and perception were enough for him to completely ignore the obstruction of the distortion. In an instant, he had already penetrated the distortion and sent his gaze to the layer of sky behind the distortion, where the world and the state of chaos intersected. Over there, he could see a strange vortex appearing. The distortion was extremely strange. It seemed like something was devouring the endless surroundings. It was like the sky formed by the state of chaos and the world intertwining. What Luo Fan sensed was this whirlpool, or rather, what existed inside this whirlpool. Let me see what it is, thought Luo Fan. With that thought, he raised his hand and grabbed forward. With this grab, his palm pierced through the endless obstructions in an instant and reached deep into the sky, directly grabbing towards the depths of the vortex. His current level of cultivation had already reached the level of entering calamity. This realm, compared to the cultivation realm of his main body, was naturally hundreds of millions of miles away. But that was only compared to his original body. Honestly speaking, his current cultivation level was enough for him to obtain almost infinite power. With this kind of almost infinite power, even the strange power formed by the state of chaos and the world could not completely erode his power in a short period of time. Of course, it was only for a short period of time. After all, it was a product that contained the characteristics of the state of chaos and the world's power. Even if it was a simulation of the great calamity, it was still a fatal existence to beings that could not completely transcend the limits of the world. It might be possible to resist it for a short period of time, but to resist it for a long period of time, or even control it, was an almost impossible task. Zizi. The moment his hand reached into the vortex, a strange sound suddenly came from his hand. Then, traces of corrosion rapidly appeared on the surface of his hand. His skin, muscles, blood vessels, and even bones were rapidly peeled off under the effect of the corrosion. Luo Fan had long been prepared for this change, but at this time he was completely unfazed by it. Even his movements did not slow down in the slightest. In just an instant, he had already touched something in the center of the vortex. It was a strange spherical object that was about 2 feet in diameter. It lay quietly in the center of the vortex, producing a terrifying suction force that could shake the heavens and the earth, constantly absorbing everything around it. Even the moment Luo Fan's hand touched it, he felt the suction force acting on his hand. It began to crazily cut his flesh and bones, sending them into the center of the spherical object. During this process, he could clearly feel his flesh and bones being cut and peeled off. Luo Fan frowned slightly at this moment. This thing is quite extraordinary. With that thought in mind, he grabbed the spherical object with his hand and exerted force, forcibly pulling it out of the vortex. Amidst the creaking sounds, a strange spherical object that was 2 feet in diameter slowly broke away from the vortex and gradually emerged, slowly suspending in the void. This object was chaotic and seemed to be a mass of gray airflow that was constantly rolling, but it seemed extremely sturdy, as if nothing in the world could shake it. As it kept breaking away from the vortex, an indescribable tremor came from within, as if some existence was struggling fiercely, and also as if some existence was roaring crazily. Its ability to attract and absorb everything in its surroundings had also skyrocketed by an unknown amount. It felt as if even Luo Fan's palm was about to be completely devoured in an instant. Chaos creature? No, it doesn't look like a chaos creature. On the contrary, it looks more like a creature born from this world. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. He had many speculations about the nature of this spherical object. After all, not only did he touch this spherical object with his own hands, but he also saw its appearance directly. At this moment, he had already sensed the nature of this object, which was why he had so many speculations. In his guess, this spherical object should be a sign that some kind of creature was being born. And, judging from the inexplicable feeling this creature gave him, this creature should have some kind of connection with him. Before his palm was about to be completely corroded, Luo Fan finally took this spherical object and directly left the sky curtain that was the boundary between heaven and earth and the state of primal chaos, entering this side of the world. As the spherical object entered this world, boundless power began to flow out of the spherical object in a frenzy, as if a balloon had suddenly been popped. An indescribable despair came from the inside of the spherical object at this moment. With this despair, Luo Fan had an idea. He casually covered it with his hand, and a layer of barrier appeared between this spherical object and the world, completely isolating this spherical object from the outside world. With the formation of this isolation, the continuous flow of power from this spherical object instantly stopped. The entire spherical object seemed to be suspended in a transparent balloon, becoming extremely calm. At this moment, this world began to feel unhappy. At this moment, a layer of dark clouds began to appear above the void at the edge of this world. It was a layer of incomparably dark, looking like a liquid product formed by condensing ink or even evaporating water. An indescribable pressure descended from the sky, enveloping Luo Fan's palm that was gradually recovering. This appearance was extremely similar to the appearance of the Great Emperor when he obtained something from the border between the state of chaos and the world and returned. "There's no need to go against you now." As he muttered to himself, Luo Fan casually withdrew his hand and brought the spherical object through the infinite barrier. He directly returned to his palace and appeared in front of his body. When he arrived here, the spherical object began to tremble slightly. There seemed to be some kind of excitement, some kind of regret, and some kind of guilt coming from it. However, this change only appeared for a moment. Soon, the various emotions that were transmitted disappeared completely and was replaced by absolute calmness. It was a calmness that was deeper and more stable than the calmness he felt when he had just escaped misfortune. In this calmness, people felt that even if the world collapsed and the world was destroyed, it wouldn't matter to him. It seemed that as long as he arrived here, he had already arrived at the safest place in the universe. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. "So it's you. I didn't expect you to be born from the border between the world and the state of chaos, and not from this world." Why did he come to such a realization? There was no other reason other than that he had already understood that the spherical object in front of him was most likely formed from the reincarnation of the Great Emperor. As for why it was like this, and why it would appear at the border between the world and the state of chaos, he had not thought of it before. Now, with a thought, he already had some guesses. The reason was probably because the Great Emperor was an existence that could resonate with the true saint that was born from the perfect world that was used as a template by the world. An existence at the true saint level had already completely disregarded the shackles of the world. To them, there was not much difference between being in the state of chaos and being in the state of chaos. Under such circumstances, perhaps there would be more traces of the true saint in the state of chaos around the world than the traces of the true saint that existed in the state of chaos. It was just like in the theory of evolution, humans walked out from the ocean. However, there would obviously be more traces of humans at the edge of the ocean than in the ocean. Chapter 23:38. Looking at the sphere quietly lying in the barrier that he had set up, Luo Fan completely understood why he could sense it. The relationship between him and the Great Emperor could be said to be complicated, but it could also be said to be simple. To put it in a complicated way, the Great Emperor had received a large amount of inheritance from him and received many benefits. The Great Emperor had even treated him like a teacher. However, in the end, it was also because of him that the Great Emperor had died and only left behind a mark to reincarnate. It had taken him so many years to obtain the chance to return. To put it in a simple way, the relationship between them was really simple. After all, this Great Emperor was created by this world and was used as a source of power to deal with him. To be honest, he was just an enemy, Under such a relationship, Luo Fan had grasped an extremely subtle and mysterious possibility behind him. In his heart, he regarded it as a possibility for him to deal with this world. It was because of this that he had such a strong feeling towards the great emperor. Looking at the sphere, he knew that if he allowed the sphere to evolve naturally, it would take tens of thousands of years for the sphere to completely evolve and return to the world. However, if that was the case, it would be greatly affected by the mark left behind by the true saint. In the end, it might even suppress the mark he had left in the great emperor's heart and cause the great emperor to completely forget him. All the preparations that he had made would be for naught. In that case, he naturally gave up on the possibility of waiting quietly and allowing the sphere to evolve naturally. Immediately, he raised his hand and pointed at the air. In an instant, boundless power began to gather towards the sphere in front of him from all directions. In the blink of an eye, it formed a huge whirlpool and began to compress the interior of the sphere. In just a few breaths, it had completely entered the sphere, and the sphere began to change at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. The originally chaotic appearance gradually turned into the appearance of a perfectly round crystal ball. There was a crystal clear feeling within it. As it floated there and rotated slightly, there seemed to be some kind of indescribable spirituality that kept seeping out. A kind of joy gradually spread out from the sphere and filled the surrounding barrier. It even gradually filled the vast universe inside the palace. "Open!" Luo Fan shouted. An indescribable tremor came from his voice and quickly gathered towards the sphere. It began to shake the sphere, causing it to jump. The throbbing became faster and more intense. After a few dozen breaths, a thunderous roar suddenly came from the sphere. Subsequently, countless cracks appeared on the surface of the sphere, and then it transformed into countless fragments that shot out in all directions along with a gust of wind. The power of these fragments was so strong that in just an instant, the starry sky inside the palace had been thrown into chaos. The countless stars within were pulled by a terrifying power, and the way they operated in the void changed. The endless star essence became chaotic, no longer as mysterious as before. Instead, it was replaced by a kind of absolute chaos. Any living creature that stepped into the starry sky of the universe would have to suffer a difficult test. The fragments directly seeped into the void and pushed out of the palace. They were about to rush out of the palace and out of this place that existed between reality and illusion. At the same time, at the boundary between the perfect world and the state of chaos, the sky began to churn violently, as if some kind of anger was being transmitted from it. This scene was naturally earth-shattering. It was enough to shock anyone who could sense it and make them understand that something unimaginable was happening. However, it was obvious that there were very few people in this world who could see and sense this scene. Only a few of the 3,000 cultivators were able to vaguely sense it. Therefore, although it was an earth-shattering change that shook the entire world and shook the boundary between heaven and earth in the state of chaos, it did not cause the chaos that should have arisen at this time. The cultivation world and the entire world still acted as if nothing had happened and continued with what they were doing before. It was even to the extent that even the cultivators among the 3,000 cultivators who could vaguely sense this change didn't pay too much attention to it, because the change was too grand and had exceeded the scope of their understanding. They merely treated it as a change in the way the world operated and didn't pay too much attention to it. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan naturally could not sit back and do nothing. At this moment, he thought of something and grabbed. The void changed, and boundless power appeared out of nowhere around the countless fragments, directly wrapping them up. Even though most of the fragments had broken through the void and time and disappeared from his sight, it could not change the fate of being easily grabbed and suppressed. As he grabbed the fragments, he moved slightly and shrank his power, bringing the fragments along with him. All of a sudden, they were all grabbed back and reappeared in front of him, around the powerful existence that had drilled out of the crystal ball. It was a baby that was only 100 days old and looked extremely fragile. The baby had 3 eyes and 4 elbows. It was the appearance of the most orthodox, born Taoism aptitude in the world. At this moment, it opened its eyes and looked at the countless fragments around it. Its eyes were filled with endless desire, and it suddenly opened its mouth and inhaled. The countless fragments gathered into a river and began to rush towards its mouth from all directions. In the blink of an eye, all of them had gathered. As the countless fragments converged, the baby's body began to grow rapidly, like a seed germinating. In just a few short breaths, it had grown from a baby that was 100 days old to a child that was about 5 or 6 years old. At this moment, the countless crystals had been used up, and not a single one was left. Obviously, after the power of all the crystals had been used up, the baby could only grow to this stage. At this moment, the baby turned around and suddenly bowed to Luo Fan, shouting, "Your disciple kowtows to you, teacher. You still have your previous memories?" Luo Fan said with a faint smile. Hearing this, a perplexed expression appeared on the child's face. He shook his head and said, "I've already lost most of my memories. I only remember some fragmented fragments. Among them, the fact that you're my teacher is the most stubborn." Hearing this, Luo Fan already understood what was going on with the child's memories. Thinking about it, because of his interruption, the child should have obtained the memories of resonating with the true divine, but he did not obtain much. Even the countless cultivation experiences he had accumulated in his previous life were also lost because of this loss. Subsequently, the memories of his previous life became fragmented and messy, which led to the current situation. However, perhaps to him, this was really a good thing. After all, in his previous life's cultivation experience, apart from the guidance he received from Luo Fan, a large part of his own understanding came from resonating with the true divine. Not to mention that after he entered the chaotic state and the boundary between heaven and earth, he received endless information and endless understanding. At that time, all the information and mysteries that he had obtained had been transferred directly from the true sage's place. In this way, if he completely recovered those memories in this life, wouldn't he once again fall into the same fate as in his previous life? Similarly, he was assimilated by the true divine, and, similarly, he could not obtain his true self. In contrast, now that he had only recovered some fragmented memories, he only had a deep understanding of his own fundamental situation. However, this was the best outcome. Now that you have been reborn, you need to completely cut off the connection with your previous life. Today, I will grant you the name of Era Severing. Are you willing? Luo Fan said calmly to the great emperor. When the child heard this, his 3 eyes lit up, and he thanked him joyfully. Era Severing, thank you, teacher, for giving me the name. Just as he agreed, he suddenly felt that an extremely heavy sky covering his heart seemed to be suddenly lifted. A kind of unprecedented relaxation, liveliness, and excitement appeared in his heart at this time, making him feel unprecedentedly comfortable. Even his expression became relaxed. At the same time, Luo Fan also felt that a certain kind of resonance that was produced from his body and connected with the supreme existence in and out of heaven and earth had suddenly weakened. Although it was not completely cut off, it had become faintly discernible, as if it could be cut off at any time. It seems that this method is effective. Looking at this scene, how could Luo Fan not know that his plan was indeed effective? At that moment, he did not waste any more time and began to talk about the most orthodox way of cultivation in this world to Era Severing. He began to explain the essence of the countless cultivation methods that he had collected through the many fragments to the child bit by bit. The content went from shallow to deep. Bit by bit, it contained the deepest level of wisdom. It contained the mysteries that were enough to shock any cultivator and any powerhouse. Era Severing was not an ordinary child, but a powerhouse who had many memories of his previous life. Although the memories of his previous life that he had obtained were only fragmented fragments, those fragments alone had actually raised his knowledge to a level that was far beyond that of any other cultivator. In this way, The content that Luo Fan was preaching in front of him was very profound and profound. Naturally, he understood it as soon as he heard it. For a moment, his heart was filled with shock and surprise. Then, he directly expelled all the distracting thoughts in his body and began to listen to the content that Luo Fan was speaking with all his heart, trying to understand any kind of thoughts that Luo Fan was conveying. Time passed by slowly. Unknowingly, 300 years had passed. During these 300 years, the universe in this palace did not seem to have changed at all. It was still in the strange state between chaos and peace, maintaining the state that was previously disturbed by the countless fragments. It was as if not a single minute or second had really taken effect in this palace in the past 300 years. However, compared to the stagnation of this palace, in the center of this palace, the figure in front of Luo Fan had vividly displayed the passage of time. In fact, it even made people suspect that not only had 300 years passed, but 3 million years, 30 million years, 300 million years had passed. This was because at this moment, Duan Shi, who was hovering in front of Luo Fan in the center of this palace, had unknowingly grown from a 5- or 6-year-old child to a young man who looked like he was in his 20s. As for his cultivation realm, he had unknowingly broken through the realm that countless cultivators dreamed of breaking through, the false saint realm. In just 300 years, he had actually advanced step by step, growing from an ordinary mortal child who had no power to a false saint. Although he was not a true false saint that could transcend all the influence of heaven and earth, and he was only a false saint in the inner universe of this palace that Luo Fan had built, his progress was already beyond the imagination of all living beings. Normally speaking, not to mention 300 years, ordinary cultivators would not be able to complete such progress and grow into a false saint even after 3 million, 30 million, or 300 million years. Because of this, if one only looked at Duan Shi's progress, anyone would probably suspect if their perception of time was messed up. The previous period of time was not 300 years, but even longer. On this day, Luo Fan stopped and said to Duan Shi, "Let's stop this time. Your current cultivation realm has already reached its limit. If you continue to improve, your foundation will probably become unstable, and it won't be worth it." Hearing this, an indescribable expression appeared on Duan Shi's face. He seemed to be a little regretful, a little unwilling, a little grateful, and a little afraid. The complicated expression on his face showed how complicated his feelings were at this moment. After all, it was not like he really did not know anything. How could he not know how heaven-defying it was to obtain such a huge improvement in 300 years? He knew very well how terrifying the impact of such an astonishing increase on his foundation would be. Chapter 23:39. After stopping, Luo Fan said to Duan Shi directly, "Not long from now, there will be another tribulation in the world. This tribulation isn't too big, but it's the best opportunity for you to train. You can go and undergo the tribulation." Hearing this, Duan Shi could not help but be stunned. Tribulation? Why were there so many tribulations in this world? He remembered that the first tribulation was only tens of thousands of years after the world was created. After that, another tens of thousands of years later was the tribulation that cleansed the world. It had only been tens of thousands of years since then, so why was there another tribulation? Luo Fan was not in the mood to explain this. Anyway, with Duan Shi's current strength as a false saint, as long as he left the palace and entered the outside world, he would naturally be able to find out everything and figure it out. No matter how much he said at this time, it would just be a waste of his saliva. Therefore, although he could see Duan Shi's doubts, he still waved his hand and sent him out. Seeing that Luo Fan was not in the mood to explain, Duan Shi could only bid farewell to Luo Fan obediently and leave the palace. The reason why Duan Shi became a false sage was because of Luo Fan's cosmos starry sky, or rather, this hall. Under such circumstances, after he left this palace, his cultivation realm began to decrease greatly. From the original false saint stage, it directly dropped to the peak of the false saint stage. To him, this decrease in cultivation realm was as huge as going from an immortal to a mortal. He could not help but take a long time to catch his breath and adjust his unbalanced mentality back to normal with great difficulty. It's still a little unstable after all. Fortunately, teacher has a good judgment. Otherwise, if this continued, I'm afraid it would be difficult to turn back in the future. After catching his breath, Duan Shi sighed to himself. What he was sighing about was naturally Luo Fan's decision to stop him from continuously improving. Fortunately, Luo Fan had stopped him before. Otherwise, if he continued to improve like this, his foundation would become more and more unstable. In the end, when he left the palace, he might directly lose his strength due to the imbalance in his mentality. In the end, he would fall into the final fate of his previous life and be completely minced by his own strength, ending his current life. This feeling did not stay in his heart for long. When he left the place that was in between reality and illusion and re-entered this world, countless mysterious senses surged into his heart. Continuous tribulations. How can this be? Is this really the world of my previous life? Why didn't I sense so many tribulations in my previous life? Duan Shi could not help but be shocked as he sensed the countless senses. One must know that according to his senses, there would be tribulations every tens of thousands of years. Moreover, perhaps every single tribulation wasn't anything serious to the world itself, but to the countless living beings in this world, every single tribulation was a challenge to their lives. According to his senses, any single tribulation was capable of destroying at least half of the living beings in this world. There were two reasons why Duan Shi was able to sense everything so clearly. Firstly, although his cultivation had fallen to the peak of pseudo-saint stage 9 after he left the palace and was much weaker than his original pseudo-saint stage, he was still a pseudo-saint stage 9 after all. His cultivation and strength were still not something that any cultivator in this world could compare to. Their perception and deduction abilities were naturally much stronger than all the other living beings in this world. The second reason was that the heavens and earth didn't conceal the fact that the heavens and earth were about to encounter continuous tribulations like they did with other secrets of the heavens and fate. In other words, the heavens and earth were intentionally revealing the unending tribulations that were about to appear in the heavens and earth to all living beings, making it thousands of times easier for living beings and cultivators to discover this than to discover other heavenly secrets. It was precisely because of this that he was able to obtain so much information so easily and in such detail. Very soon, Duan Shi discovered the source of the endless tribulations through his senses. The imprints of those chaotic creatures. His three eyes shone brightly as if there was an infinite amount of divine light flashing crazily in his three eyes. An indescribable resentment kept seeping out from the depths of his eyes. He already knew the truth about the countless tribulations. He understood that he and the others were already being used as whetstones by the heavens and earth. A whetstone that wore itself down to help the heavens and earth grow. From the standpoint of the heavens and earth, it was only natural to do so. After all the living beings in the heavens and earth were born from it. It could be said that they were all its creations. Under such circumstances, what was wrong with using its creations to help it grow? However, it was obvious that this was only for the heavens and earth itself. For these living beings who were being used as whetstones, this was a fate that they absolutely could not accept. One must know that although they were born from the heavens and earth and could be considered as the heavens and earth's creations, they also had their own sense of self. However, they also had their own consciousness, independent will, and independent emotions. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how painful it was for them to discover that the heavens and earth were intentionally imposing tribulations on them and sacrificing most of their lives to help them grow bit by bit. At the same time, Duan Shi finally understood where the faint resentment that permeated the heavens and earth came from. This was because he could not help but feel an inexplicable resentment toward the heavens and earth after a long while. He finally sighed. Although there was resentment in his heart, this sort of tribulation was not something he could eliminate. There was only one thing he could do right now, and that was to work hard to help this world overcome these tribulations one after another. Moreover, he could absorb as much as he could from these tribulations, so that his own cultivation could be improved as much as possible and ascend to a higher level. It's a great danger for me to resonate with a true saint, but I can't care about what happens to the living beings in this heavens and earth. Then, he turned to look in a certain direction. That thought flashed through his mind, but he eventually got rid of all the distracting thoughts in his heart. Resonating with a true saint was a fatal danger to anyone who wanted to maintain their own consciousness. After all, a true saint was a supreme existence compared to any other existence who had not become a true saint. This kind of existence was simply too profound, too grand, too mysterious, and too profound. It had even reached the point where a trace of its aura was enough to completely assimilate any existence who had not become a true saint. Under such circumstances, resonating with a true saint was equivalent to the true saint's essence floating above one's head and could descend and merge with it at any time. This was obviously equivalent to one enduring the danger of being assimilated by a true saint at all times. If one was not careful and accepted the resonance, one would be able to comprehend endless things and obtain endless mysteries that belong to a true saint. However, oneself would also be assimilated by a true saint. In the end, oneself would completely disappear and one would become some kind of incarnation of a true saint. Duan Shi, who had received careful guidance from Luo Fan, was very clear about this. At this moment, he was looking in the direction where an indescribable feeling was constantly being transmitted to him. It was a strange feeling transmitted by a mysterious existence that was trying to attract him to merge with it and come into contact with it. If he had not received guidance from Luo Fan, he would definitely regard this as his own opportunity. Even if there were thousands of obstacles in front of him, he would break through them and go directly. However, now that he had received guidance from Luo Fan, he had already seen through the danger and understood that it was a trap that seemed beautiful but was actually extremely dangerous. A trap that targeted his independent existence. Immediately, he turned around and flew in the opposite direction. "Who are you?" Not long after, a wave of energy appeared around Duan Shi, and a series of questions entered his ears. An inexplicable feeling of being watched entered Duan Shi's heart. "It's so familiar. They seem to be my acquaintances from my previous life." Duan Shi's heart skipped a beat as this thought flashed across his mind. It was the fragments of subtle senses left behind from his previous life that gave him an indescribable sense of familiarity from the feeling of being watched. However, it was something that happened in his previous life, after all. What was left now were only some extremely broken fragments. Therefore, although he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity, it was impossible for him to confirm who the owner of the feeling of being watched was, what their identity was, and so on. He stopped in his tracks and calmly said, "Who are you? I've just been born, and I'm sure I don't have any enemies in this world. Why are you blocking my way?" As he spoke, his 3 eyes narrowed. His gaze seemed to pierce through the barriers of countless space-time and saw a certain palace deep in the layers of space-time. The palace also gave him an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Many of the details were even deeply imprinted in the fragments of memories he had left behind in his previous life. This made him understand that this palace was most likely created by him in his previous life. "Who exactly are you and teacher origin of the technique? Why did you appear at the place where teacher origin of the technique disappeared?" One after another, figures appeared outside the palace. One of them asked. This person looked like a middle-aged man. His entire body was surging with an aura that seemed to shake the void as he stood there. It was as if time and space could not restrict his existence and could not withstand his presence. This person was an existence at the peak of the demi-saint realm. He was only a step away from the false saint realm. This person also gave Duan Sure an incomparably familiar feeling. Moreover, it was an unprecedented sense of familiarity that surpassed everything else and everyone else. Great Emperor? Suddenly, the figure muttered as if he sensed something. There was disbelief in the depth of his eyes. However, he soon shook his head. No, you're not him. Although you look like him, you're definitely not him. He let out a long sigh as he said this. He seemed to be a little relaxed, but also a little disappointed. He seemed to be inexplicably complicated. At this moment, Duan Sure smiled faintly and said, I'm Teacher's new disciple. This time, Teacher saw the impending disaster and asked me to come out of the mountain to train myself. You must be the strongest people in this world right now, right? That'll save me the trouble of looking for you. As he spoke, his heart skipped a beat. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure directly broke through the barrier of time and space as he rapidly approached the palace. Throughout the entire process, his figure was like an extremely sturdy object that was pushing away ice and snow. The scene was extremely violent and shocking. The palace was naturally the place where the 3,000 cultivators, who were the source of the order of this world, resided. In other words, it was where the authority of this world was located. All this while, the 3,000 cultivators had always been the ones who summoned others. No one had ever taken the initiative to find out where they were and come to the palace of their own accord. This was also the reason why they dared to question Duan Shure's identity, even though they could clearly sense how powerful he was and knew that he was many times stronger than the strongest among them. They even dared to use their power to imprison Duan Shure. However, at this moment, they realized that the thing that they thought they could rely on was actually so fragile. Yet, under the hands of the figure in front of him, he was actually smashed into pieces without any resistance. For a moment, an inexplicable panic appeared in the hearts of the 3,000 cultivators, causing their expressions to change. There were even some who couldn't hold it in any longer. They had already activated their powerful abilities and started to attack the figure that was pressing towards them. In the face of such changes, Duan Shure only smiled faintly. He did not even need to take any action. Just the aura that he emitted was enough to easily destroy the powers that were constantly bombarding him. He was not affected at all. He easily arrived before the palace and stood at the entrance of the palace. At this step, there were countless mysterious and complicated formation runes constantly flickering and circulating around the palace. Vaguely, there was an unparalleled power brewing at this moment and began to gather towards Duan Shure. It was as if a huge thunderbolt had begun to compress above his head and could erupt at any time. Seeing this, Duan Shure only smiled faintly and poked with his hand. Countless forces were emitted from his hand and directly rushed into the endless formation runes around him, causing all kinds of indescribable reactions with the countless forces within. Chapter 2340. At this moment, the 3,000 cultivators in the palace rushed out one by one. The palace would usually protect the 3,000 cultivators. Now that the palace could no longer hold on, it would be their turn to protect the palace. Duan Shure only smiled faintly in the face of such a change. He looked at the cultivators who appeared one after another, but did not do anything, let alone attack them. Who are you? The peak quasi-saint asked solemnly. At this moment, all the cultivators' energy was surging in their bodies. Their divine abilities, powers, and artifacts were all brewing in their bodies, ready to burst out at a fixed target at any time. The reason why they did not attack immediately was simple. It was because Duan Shure's strength was too powerful and his attitude was a little complicated. It did not seem like he had any ill intentions. Is it important who I am? I think the most important thing for all of you now is the upcoming tribulation, right? Duan Shure said faintly. Hearing this, the expressions of the cultivators couldn't help but change. Although they were extremely displeased with this person's attitude, they had to admit that what he said was the truth at this moment. Facing the endless tribulations, they had to unite all the forces in the world and gather all the existences that they could find that could assist them. In comparison, although the identity of the cultivator in front of them was unknown, There was no doubt that he was powerful. If such a powerful force could become their helper and help them resist the upcoming tribulation together, it would naturally be a great thing for them. However, if this cultivator were to become their enemy, and this power that they had originally yearned for turned into a power that was against them, then the result would be one disaster on top of another. The peak quasi-saint was very decisive. He made a prompt decision and withdrew all his energy. He said, "Since you're willing to resist the tribulations with us, please come in." As he spoke, he made an inviting gesture and invited Duan Shur into the palace. Duan Shur was not surprised by his reaction. Based on his familiarity with this cultivator, he knew that this was the cultivator's final decision before he even spoke. At that moment, he calmly stepped into the palace. What happened next was a matter of course. Although the crowd was still doubtful about Duan Shur's identity, the knowledge, strength, and means that Duan Shur had displayed had shocked all the cultivators. Therefore, in just a few years, Duan Shur had risen from an outsider that many cultivators were wary of to the top of the 3,000 cultivators. He had even reached a position where he could fight against a peak sage-to-be. In other words, in just a few short years, he had become one of the two people with the highest status in this world. His right to speak in this world had also increased to an unimaginable level. If any other cultivator in the world experienced such a change in status and power, it would naturally be enough to shock them to the point of losing their normal state of mind. However, none of this could cause any ripples in Duan Shur's heart. It wasn't because he looked down on everything else that came with this position, but because he was too familiar with all of this. He was so familiar with this position that he felt like he had always been in this position, or even a higher position. Now that he had regained this position, he was just regaining his position and power. In this way, this kind of gain would at most make him feel like he had lost something and regained it. How could it affect him so much? How could he lose his composure because of this? When Duan Shur obtained this position, the way that this world dealt with the tribulations gradually changed. Initially, it was only the preparation for various formations, magical treasures, and supernatural powers against living beings. Gradually, it was added to deal with astronomical phenomena, the evolution of nature, and the changes in the rules and laws of this world. The other cultivators did not understand this. They did not know what the purpose of all these preparations was. However, they also knew that with these preparations, the entire way of dealing with the tribulations was much stricter and more perfect. The faint uneasiness that was brought about by the way of dealing with the tribulations had also faded a lot. Coupled with the improvement of Duan Shur's position in the past few years, the changes were finally carried out without any objection. Is it really him or not? On this day, somewhere in the palace, the peak sage-to-be looked at a vaguely familiar figure and had the same doubt in his heart. The various means that this person had used over the years contained a profound perspective and knowledge. All of them allowed him to see the shadow of that supreme existence that once occupied the highest position in this world. In fact, even his aura and appearance allowed him to sense traces of that existence. However, such a thing was obviously impossible. They had made countless deductions back then, and the results of their deductions clearly told them that this existence was already dead. His soul had been scattered, and not a single trace of him remained. The result of this deduction was so absolute that it was completely different from the ambiguous results of other deductions. It was so much so that over the past few years, the 3,000 cultivators had even found some opportunities to carefully deduce this matter, and the results were the same as before. In the end, they all clearly told them that the person before them was not the same person from back then, that existence from all those years ago had still perished, and his soul had dispersed without a trace remaining. In this way, no matter how similar the figure before him was to that existence back then, it was impossible for the peak quasi-saint to think that it was him. However, if it was not him, then who was this person before him? Could it be his descendant? Or was it some kind of special existence that the origin of the technique had created using him as a template? Duan Shur suddenly smiled when he sensed the peak quasi-saint's gaze. He said, "I know what you're thinking, but what you're thinking about is meaningless." The peak quasi-saint trembled slightly when he heard this. He calmly said, "How is it meaningless? Although it's unlikely, the source of this calamity is the mark of the chaotic creature with the word come. The mark could appear anywhere, and could also appear in the body of any living being." What he meant was that Duan might also have the mark of the chaotic creature on him. In other words, he might also be part of the source of this world's calamity. Duan chuckled and said, "Just wait and see. No matter what I say now, you'll be able to find some flaws if you doubt me." As he spoke, he could not be bothered to care about the peak quasi-saint anymore. He was just preparing for the calamity. The calamity had arrived as scheduled. When the time recorded in the cultivation techniques was up, the world shook slightly as if there was a subtle change. Following that, countless strange natural sceneries appeared all over the world out of nowhere. Following that, many cultivators that looked normal suddenly underwent a drastic change. In the blink of an eye, they were filled with a destructive aura that was not there before. Amidst this destructive aura, their power and aura began to rise crazily. They even began to distort the surrounding space-time and laws, causing the region they were in to gradually change. Not long after, it became a state that was incompatible with the outside world. Following that, roars were heard from all over the world. There were just too many roars, and their voices were just too loud. When they converged together, it made the entire world seem as if it was the end of the world. An extremely desolate and terrifying atmosphere began to spread in the world. At this moment, the world shook. The preparations that the 3,000 cultivators and Duan had made were triggered. Almost 30% of the living beings that had undergone such changes were taken away by the wave of attacks that they had prepared. However, even though the living beings were taken away, it did not mean that the disaster that they had brought was over. The reality was the exact opposite. They were taken away in a single wave, causing the destruction they had caused to go out of control. It began to spread in all directions, endlessly destroying everything in the world, whether it was time, space, laws, or even the existence of the world itself. Everything was within the scope of this endless destruction. Of course, it did not mean that taking away the living beings was a mistake. After all, those living beings were the source of the chaos and destruction. As long as these living beings existed, no matter how the destruction was restrained or controlled, it would still cause an incomparably great impact in the end. In fact, due to the condensation of their power when they were rampaging, if these living beings didn't die, the destruction they caused would be more than 10 times greater than when they were randomly spreading out. Due to that reason, the 3,000 cultivators, including Duan were extremely calm as the destruction spread. They were not affected at all. On the contrary, the other cultivators were in awe of Duan decision. One must know that they were only making preparations to deal with those living beings. It was because of Duan participation that they were able to spread their preparations to other aspects that might affect the world. Clearly, the changes in the world at this moment proved that their previous preparations were wise. If they hadn't made such preparations, they wouldn't have been helpless in the face of the destruction caused by the death of so many living beings in this world. However, in comparison, it was inevitable that they would be flustered. If they were flustered when the calamity had just arrived, it would definitely trigger a chain reaction. By then, it would become more and more difficult for them to deal with it. In the end, their losses might even increase by several times. Under such circumstances, how could they not be in awe of Duan decision? Duan did not take the admiration of the cultivators to heart. At this time, he kept in mind all the knowledge that Luo Fan had imparted to him. He integrated his body and mind into the various formations, magical abilities, and powers that he was controlling. He did his utmost to fight against the creatures with the marks of the primordial chaos creatures. He did his utmost to prevent them from destroying this world, and he also did his utmost to eliminate them. The calamity this time was extremely fierce. It had only been a few years since the beginning of the calamity to the most intense war. When the tribulation arrived, almost every region in the world was plunged into war. After the calamity was awakened, Not only were the feelings of the living beings with the marks of chaos creatures completely wiped out, but their intelligence and strength were also enhanced beyond imagination. As a result, their strength was naturally many times stronger than before. Among them, many of them even broke through the innate Grand Luo realm and stepped into the quasi-saint realm. Moreover, because these living beings possessed the imprints of chaos creatures, the power that they could unleash was many times greater than that of living beings in this world at the same level of strength. With such powerful strength, it went without saying that the destructive power that they could cause was unimaginable. It could be said that even with Duan Shi and the various preparations that the 3,000 cultivators had made, the world was still struggling to hold on. In the end, after spending a few decades, paying the price of half of the world collapsing and nearly 50% to 60% of the living beings dying, the world, or in other words, Duan Shi and the others finally survived the calamity with great difficulty. Finally, all the living beings with the marks of chaos creatures were sent back into the cycle of reincarnation. It's a pity that not only are these marks extremely tough, but they're also protected by the world. It's impossible to destroy them. Otherwise, we could just destroy these marks once and for all. In the end, the peak quasi-saint sighed as the world returned to normal. Upon hearing that, Duan Shi sighed and said, "Isn't it only natural? To the world, the value of these marks is probably more than 100 times greater than all of us combined. How could it allow us to destroy these marks? Moreover, even if we can destroy these marks, it's not enough to solve the problem once and for all. Don't forget that the second calamity of the world is still hanging over our heads in hundreds of millions of years." Duan Shi changed the topic. His words left the peak quasi-saint speechless. After all, he couldn't bring himself to lie through his teeth. Chapter 23:41. The peak sage-to-be asked. Senior Duan Shi said that he came out this time to gain enlightenment from the tribulations. However, Senior Duan Shi has been hiding in the palace during the tribulations. Is this how Senior Duan Shi trains himself? Duan Shi suddenly revealed a smile when he heard the questioning words and said, "As expected, your vision is still limited to such a shallow and direct level." The peak sage-to-be could not help but feel bewildered when he heard Duan Shi's direct denial. The source of these complicated emotions was naturally quite obvious. First of all, he was naturally quite displeased with this kind of behavior of denying his own knowledge. He felt that this was an offense to him, and it was a denial of his own knowledge of cultivation and the world. However, on the other hand, he understood that the person in front of him was an expert who was many times stronger than him. Duan Shi's words might not be nonsense. It was precisely because of these considerations that he became so anxious and doubtful. Cultivation isn't just about fighting. Duan Shi did not say anything else. He ended the topic with this sentence. After all, although his cultivation realm was many times stronger than the peak sage-to-be, it did not mean that he had the obligation to guide the peak sage-to-be. It did not mean that he had to help the peak sage-to-be solve all the doubts that he had. However, such a sentence had already made the pinnacle of the sage-to-be comprehend. He vaguely felt that he had touched the barrier between the sage-to-be realm and the false sage realm. The feeling of breaking through, which had been trying hard for tens of thousands of years, once again appeared in his heart. Of course, this feeling was extremely weak at this moment. After all, it was just an ordinary sentence. It did not have the ability to send someone into a new realm. At this moment, Duan Shi completely ignored the peak sage-to-be. He stood up and said, "I'll leave the rest to you. We'll meet again if fate allows it." As he spoke, his figure gradually turned blurry and soon disappeared completely, as if he had never been there. Only then did the peak quasi-saint react to his departure. He could not help but feel a sense of loss, and vaguely felt an indescribable pressure suddenly pressing down on him. Previously, when Duan Shi was still here, due to Duan Shi's domineering attitude, his authority was greatly affected. Every decision had to be made with his presence in mind, making it difficult for his will to be carried out. Due to that, he hated Duan Shi's existence to the core. He could not wait for Duan Shi to disappear right away. However, When the broken world finally disappeared, he realized that he was at a loss without the broken world. The power that he had grasped in his hands before the appearance of the broken era suddenly became heavy. Many of the things that he had planned out, well, suddenly became specious. The various plans and arrangements that he had made were no longer that carefree feeling. Instead, it was an indescribable pressure. It was as if this world was completely different from the world that he controlled in the past. How did it become like this? The peak quasi-saint had deep control over his mind, so he understood the changes as soon as they appeared. He could not help but feel puzzled. He turned to look at the remaining cultivators below and saw an indescribable sense of loss in the depths of their eyes. It was as if they had suddenly lost some central support. So, we've unknowingly developed a dependence on Duan Shi. The peak quasi-saint could not help but smile bitterly as he understood the source of all these changes. As he sighed, he did his best to focus his mind. He tried his best to cut off the dependence he had on Breaker for helping the world through the calamity. Fortunately, he was already at the pinnacle of the sage-to-be. He was not an ordinary cultivator, nor was he an ordinary living being. Although it was difficult at this moment, he still managed to achieve this step. He had completely severed his dependence and regained his clarity of mind. At the same time, he felt that the authority that had returned to his hands had become comfortable. After that, he said to the crowd, "Everything will return to the right track. For the sake of all living beings in the world, and for ourselves, we need to help the world recover its vitality as soon as possible. The next calamity isn't far away." His words contained a subtle fluctuation that directly entered the ears of the cultivators in the hall and spread into their bodies, causing the power within them to tremble subtly. The cultivators were shocked when they heard this. For a moment, their minds suddenly became clear, as if some kind of power had swept away the fog in their minds, allowing them to suddenly wake up. After all, the peak quasi-saint was only one step away from reaching the pseudo-sage realm. In the eyes of Duan Shi and in the eyes of Luo Fan, he was insignificant. However, compared to the other living beings and cultivators in the world, he was still an unimaginable colossus. His power, his strength, and his willpower were absolute when compared to other cultivators. Just now, he used his will and voice to influence the minds of the cultivators, temporarily freeing them from the chaotic state of mind caused by the departure of the existence they relied on. After the minds of the cultivators became clear again, they all noticed the abnormality in themselves, and they all sucked in a breath of cold air. They were extremely grateful to the peak quasi-saint who had woken them up. After that, there was a series of arrangements for the world. After leaving the hall, Duan Shi turned into an ordinary living being and entered the world to travel to him. This kind of travel was even more important than the effort he put in during the calamity. In other words, it was more beneficial to him. Amidst the tribulation, he had truly sensed all sorts of feelings and impact from the battle between all living beings and the living beings that carried the mark of primal chaos. He had also absorbed some of the nutrients that he needed to improve his cultivation. However, it was only one-sided. Cultivation was not only about battles and confrontations. At this very moment, everything that he had experienced as he roamed the world encompassed all aspects of cultivation. Only then was it able to affect him in all aspects. Tens of thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. In these tens of thousands of years, Duan Shi had almost personally witnessed the world prosper from the state of ruins. He had personally witnessed the originally barren land being filled with the creation of living beings again. He had personally witnessed the originally empty world being filled with the endless aura of living beings again. All of this was so natural, but it allowed his cultivation realm to naturally break through. From the false saint that could only be placed in the hall where Luo Fan was, he had broken through to a false saint that could exist independently and be placed in his own existence. This kind of breakthrough seemed to be just a small step, but it was actually extremely important. If it was before, he, who was shackled to a world or a hall, would not be able to unleash the power of a false saint even if he had the realm of a false saint. In fact, even his own life was being dragged down by the existence of the palace itself. Once there was any problem with the hall, or even if it was destroyed, he would also face problems and even die. Now that he had transcended the shackle and turned the foundation of the false saint from the original hall to himself, the situation was obviously completely different. Now, no matter where he was, he would be able to unleash the power of a false saint. He could easily suppress all false saints, regardless of whether they were peak rank 9 false saints or cultivators who were false saints, but had left the world they resided in. I've finally broken through the shackle. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the hall, murmured. At this moment, he could clearly feel that Duan Shi, who was floating in the sky, was emitting a brilliance that had not been there before. It was a brilliance that belonged only to him, different from this world, different from the true saint who resonated with him. Under the illumination of this brilliance, he became so transparent, like a beautiful piece of jade. He gave off an incomparably shocking feeling, even causing the entire world to tremble slightly. At this moment, tribulation clouds were brewing in the void with difficulty. The reason why it was difficult was because the tribulation clouds seemed to have some scruples, or rather, some hesitation. It was as if Duan Shi's breakthrough was between the recognition and rejection of this world. Duan Shi floated in the void with a blank and empty expression, as if he was immersed in an indescribable, mysterious realm. After a while, he came back to his senses and looked up at the tribulation clouds that were about to condense. Suddenly, an indescribable anger surged in his heart. Immediately afterward, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. Boundless, terrifying power instantly covered the sky within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers. With a slight tremble, the sky within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers suddenly collapsed. All of the space, time, and even the laws and rules that existed behind it collapsed at this moment, turning into countless smoke-like fragments that constantly stirred in the void. At this moment, the entire world began to tremble slightly. An indescribable fear appeared in everyone's hearts at this moment, causing the entire world to fall into an indescribable state of silence. It was as if everything in the world had disappeared, leaving only the supreme existence that was floating in the sky and using an extremely powerful force to shake the world and destroy time and space. I've finally woken up. Let's see how many fragments I can retrieve this time. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable anticipation in his heart in the palace that was in between reality and illusion. At this moment, he had retrieved more than 90% of the fragments in this world. He was only 5 or 6% away from the true perfection. However, it was this 5 or 6% that prevented him from achieving perfection in this world. Now, he did not even dare to leave this place that was in between reality and illusion. After all, there were still some fragments that were controlled by the world. No matter how powerful Luo Fan was, he would not be able to escape from it no matter how powerful he was. The heaven and earth didn't need to care about any of his methods. It only needed to use the fragments that he controlled as a guide to easily reach his origin and completely crush the more than 90% of the fragments that he had gathered with great difficulty. Then, he would once again return to the state of absolute powder. If that was not the case with Luo Fan's strength, even if he could not fight against this world and the great calamity that was triggered by it, it would not be difficult for him to completely conceal himself so that the world would not be able to detect his existence and distinguish him from other living beings. Why would he need to hide in between reality and illusion like this? Just as Luo Fan was thinking about this in the outside world, Duan Ji's method had clearly angered the world. In an instant, the tribulation clouds that had been completely annihilated along with the surrounding space-time began to gather at a crazy speed. As they gathered, the shattered space-time and the shattered rules and laws recovered. They directly formed a space-time that was exactly the same as before and completely enveloped him. At this moment, Duan Ji felt an indescribable pressure acting on his soul. It was as if the entire world was rejecting him all of a sudden, as if all the forces in the world were targeting him, trying to drive him away, trying to destroy him. Come on, I'll take whatever you have to do. I'm no longer your puppet. Duan-ji roared angrily. Amidst these words, the tribulation clouds in the sky began to condense frantically. The originally pitch-black clouds suddenly seemed to transform into an incomparably huge black hole. It was as if all gazes and light were completely sucked in. Anyone who looked at it could only feel that the sky seemed to have become a huge emptiness, crack. Following that, a deafening sound came from the ground. The entire world seemed to tremble slightly. This is the vibration coming from the tribulation clouds. However, due to the strangeness of the tribulation clouds, the sound that should have appeared did not appear at all. Instead, it was the resonance of the ground caused by the vibration that produced this sound. Even in the midst of his anger, Duan-ji instinctively guessed the reason for this strange change. Right at this moment, a palm descended from the sky, pressing down on him at a seemingly slow but actually fast speed. The palm was over 10,000 zhang in size. Even though it was formed from energy, it was so solid that it felt like a real body made of flesh and blood. There was even an unimaginably terrifying blood qi being emitted from in the air, causing Duan-shi's heartbeat to be affected, causing him to feel a subtle sense of chaos. Chapter 2342. Although he had such thoughts, it was impossible for Duan-shi to just watch as the palm completely erased him. After all, he was already a false saint who had broken free from his shackles. As a false saint, he represented omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience. After breaking free from his shackles, he had transferred his residence from a certain world or space-time in the outside world to his own body or the world or space-time in his body. Although this would slightly weaken the strength he could exert in the outside world, he was unable to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. However, a false saint was still a false saint after all. Even if he could not achieve that, he was definitely not someone a false saint could compare to. At this moment, he made up his mind and unleashed the power around him. It directly shook space-time, causing the surrounding space-time and laws to distort into countless unbelievable shapes. Accompanied by an endless brilliance, a huge palm was formed and blasted toward the sky, forcefully colliding with the palm descending from the tribulation clouds. Crack! This time, the terrifying explosion even caused the entire world to tremble. Everyone could sense the changes that were taking place due to the intense, yet subtle, trembling and shaking. All living beings understood that the world might undergo a huge change from today onwards. The power contained in the palm descending from the sky was so terrifying that it could destroy the world. However, the power that Duan-shi had gathered was not weak either. It contained the terrifying power of the world and space-time. As they collided, neither was able to suppress the other. In the end, the two were annihilated at the same time, turning into countless shock waves that spread in all directions. The shock waves completely shattered the surrounding space-time and laws, causing a strange vacuum to appear. It seemed like this place was completely independent from the outside world. Duan-shi hovered there in the face of such a change. The power around him surged as he tried his best to adjust the power in his body. An aura that transcended everything gradually leaked out. No matter how chaotic the surroundings were, no matter how empty the vacuum was, it could not stop the aura at all at this time. In the place between reality and illusion, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. His heart moved. And from the void where Duan-ji was undergoing his tribulation, there was an incomparably small existence that directly penetrated through space-time and entered the palace that was between reality and illusion. It directly penetrated the universe and entered his body. These were none other than the fragments of his soul. At this moment, although the number of fragments was not small, it was still insignificant compared to the number of fragments that he had yet to retrieve. It was not even enough to make his completion percentage jump to a noticeable number. But even so, this change was enough to make him feel pleasantly surprised, because this was only the beginning of the tribulation. For Duan-shi, surviving the previous attack was just the beginning of his tribulation. What awaited him next would be endless attacks with no end in sight. If every attack was like this, allowing him to retrieve a fragment, then it would only be a matter of time before his fragment reached perfection in this world. This obviously meant that his deduction earlier was indeed correct. The upheaval in front of him was indeed enough for him to achieve perfection once again. How could he not be excited? At this moment, the black hole-like tribulation clouds above the broken world changed once again. Another palm descended from the sky. However, this time, the palm was no longer just slapping down. It came crashing down from above. Instead, he clenched his fist and swung it down from the sky like a gigantic meteor, smashing down on Duan Shiji. It was as if this punch was going to shatter the heavens and earth and destroy the world. It was filled with the determination to destroy the heavens and earth. The space that was affected by this punch naturally turned into countless destroyed heavens and earth, time and space. After it appeared, it kept stirring, bringing with it a boundlessly terrifying momentum as it pressed down on Duan Jiesher. In the face of such an attack, Duanshi's third eye flickered with divine light. Divine abilities soared into the sky and formed countless mysterious forms in the void. Like thousands of magic treasures, they converged into a river and rushed towards the fist, colliding with it once again. Rumble, rumble, rumble. An endless series of explosions came from the point where the river and the fist collided. The river swallowed the fist in an instant, crushing and destroying the countless destroyed spacetimes around the fist. All the auras and energy within were completely eliminated and erased. Chi-chi-chi-chi. Countless strange sounds came from the point where the fist and the river collided. A powerful impact spread in all directions, and all kinds of distorted shockwaves and space-time flashed crazily at this moment. In the end, the fist broke through the river of divine abilities. Although it had shrunk by many times, a part of its power still fell on Duan Shiji's body and smashed into his body. Billions of terrifying explosions came from his body in an instant, and endless shockwaves spread in all directions. Duan Shiji let out a muffled groan, and the power in his body surged crazily. Boundless spiritual light shone continuously. After his body collapsed, it immediately condensed and returned to its original appearance. It looked as if nothing had happened, and he had not encountered any attack. However, this was of course only on the surface. In fact, compared to before, his aura was a little weaker, as if he had consumed some kind of source. What a powerful attack, but it's definitely not the trace of a true divine. If it was a true divine, I wouldn't have been able to block it so easily. At this moment, Duan Shiji raised his head and looked at the sky with an indescribable confidence in his three eyes. What did the existence of a true divine mean? In this world, apart from Luo Fan, he was probably the one who understood it the best. After all, he had received the resonance of the trace left behind by a true divine in his previous life. Just thinking about the boundless information and comprehension that were transmitted to him in an instant was enough to make him indescribably shocked. Not to mention, before he was born in this life, he was also in the trace left behind by a true divine. If it wasn't for Luo Fan who saved him, he might have fallen into the fate of his previous life again. In this case, how could he not understand the power of any trace left behind by a true divine? It could be said that if the palm and the fist were the traces left behind by a true divine, he would not be able to dodge two waves. Even the fluctuation of the aura produced by the first wave would be enough to easily wipe him out. Because of this, he had absolute confidence that the palm and the fist were not the traces left behind by a true divine. Since they were not the traces left behind by a true divine, just the image and the traces formed by the tribulations were already so powerful that he had to run for his life and use his source to barely block it. In that case, it was almost self-evident what the source of the fist and the palm was. As expected, it can only be Teacher. He smiled bitterly as he looked at the black, hole-like tribulation clouds above him. He could faintly see an incomparably vast, incomparably familiar figure floating there with a faint smile on his face. At this moment, Luo Fan had already gathered the fragments that belonged to him in the fist and condensed them into his body. This time, the number of fragments condensed was a little more than the previous time. Finally, he could feel that the percentage of fragments he had condensed was a little wriggling. At this speed, I should be able to completely condense all the fragments after 100,000 attacks, Luo Fan thought quietly as a look of anticipation appeared on his face. 100,000 attacks was naturally an attack that could make ordinary cultivators feel despair. However, for a pseudo-saint like Duan Ji, it was not unbelievable for 100,000 attacks to be gathered in a single tribulation. In fact, it could even be said to be inevitable. If there were not more than 100,000 attacks in a single tribulation, it could only be regarded as a test of the world, or even a process therefore at this moment, after recognizing that he needed 100,000 attacks to repair all the fragments. Luo Fan was not discouraged at all. Instead, he was secretly delighted. He was quite confident that he could truly turn the fragments of this world into perfection this time. While Luo Fan was secretly happy about the appearance of this tribulation, Duan Ji fell into an unimaginable torment on the other side. The black hole-like retribution cloud in the sky kept coming down, attacking again and again. Some of these attacks were like palms, fists, fingers, feet, elbows, and knees. Some are like all kinds of weapons, natural sceneries, magical treasures, and mystic abilities. They were endless and unceasing, bombarding down on the world breaker. Every single attack was a struggle between life and death for Duanshi. Although he managed to block the attacks one after another and deal with the attacks from the retribution cloud again and again, the price he paid was rather heavy. At the very least, his origin, the space-time in his body, his comprehension, and everything else were being worn down by the repeated confrontations. In just a few days, he felt as if he had been tortured for hundreds of millions of years. His entire body was emitting a dispirited aura. It could be said that the reason why he was still floating in the air was because of his unyielding will. How many attacks have I endured? 10,000, 100,000, or 1,000,000? Looking at the retribution cloud in the sky that was no different from a few days ago, such a thought flashed through Duan Ji's mind. He vaguely felt an inexplicable sense of despair. This despair instantly caused his aura to change, making him seem even more dispirited and powerless. It's only 30,000 attacks, and he's already powerless? At this moment, in the palace that was in between reality and illusion, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Duan Ji couldn't clearly calculate how many attacks he had endured because of the terrifying attacks. However, he was able to clearly calculate each attack after collecting the fragments left behind by the attacks. From the beginning until now, Duan Ji had only suffered a total of 30,000 attacks. Compared to his original plan of 100,000 attacks, it wasn't even a third of it. This made Luo Fan finally understand that he might have overestimated Duan Ji. Perhaps he still needed a long period of time to enrich himself before he could truly achieve his goal of breaking through the heavens and earth and using the traces he left behind to launch 100,000 attacks, allowing him to reassemble all his fragments and restore himself to his perfect state in the heavens and earth. However, this opportunity was quite rare. If he waited until the next time the heavens and earth triggered the heavenly realm to attack him, the situation would most likely be different. It wouldn't be as easy and smooth for him to reassemble his fragments. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. In the end, Luo Fan let out a sigh. It seems like I can only take the risk and make a move. This thought appeared in his mind, suppressing all other thoughts. Then, with a slight thought, an indescribable wave directly penetrated the barrier between reality and illusion, arrived at Duan Ji's location, and directly poured into Duan Ji's heart. The appearance of the wave instantly made Duan Ji's expression change. The energy around him surged wildly in an attempt to get rid of the wave. Obviously, he'd taken this fluctuation to be another attack from the heavenly tribulation. However, he didn't realize that the wave actually came from Luo Fan, his teacher. Naturally, Luo Fan had expected this kind of resistance. At this moment, he controlled the wave to carry out all kinds of extremely subtle and mysterious changes, easily bypassing all of Duanji's resistance. All of the attacks directly penetrated his soul and instantly connected with his soul. The moment the wave connected with his soul, Luo Fan felt an indescribable despair transmitted through Duanji's soul. Obviously, Duanji couldn't resist the wave and thought that there was no chance for him to survive, hence the indescribable despair. In the midst of this despair, Luo Fan also felt an indescribable sense of guilt and regret. The guilt seemed to be directed at him, and the regret seemed to be directed at him too. Guilt? Regret? Can I know why you're feeling guilty and regretful toward me? At this moment, Luo Fan smiled and transmitted his words through the wave. Chapter 2343. Something wasn't right. Wasn't this the inner demon attack formed by the heavenly tribulation? Why would it react in such a strange way? However, Duanshi wasn't an ordinary person. He reacted quickly and understood what was going on. An indescribable sense of shame welled up in his heart. He said, "This disciple is incompetent and has failed to live up to Master's expectations. I feel guilty because of this. However, it's a pity that I can no longer listen to Master's teachings." Luo Fan smiled faintly when he heard that. He said, "So it's because of this. There's no need for that. Your imprint is extremely strong. Even if you die this time, you can continue to reincarnate. I will still be able to find you in the future. There's no need to feel guilty or regret." Duanshi smiled bitterly when he heard that. It might be the same for Luo Fan, but it was completely different for him. After reincarnating, he would become another person. He would no longer be himself. It was just like how he didn't think that he was the great emperor in his previous life. Of course, there was no need to say that out loud. Whether it was Luo Fan or him, they both knew this very well. Luo Fan didn't wait for Duanshi to refute him. After saying that, he said, "The heavenly tribulation is both a calamity and an opportunity. You're making a big mistake by treating it as a calamity." As he spoke, he began to explain the various mysteries of the heavenly tribulation to Duanshi. As he explained, Duanshi was suddenly enlightened. Then, he felt remorseful. Suddenly, he became excited. In a trance, he felt enlightened. The fog that was covering his reality seemed to have disappeared in the blink of an eye. After explaining everything that Duanshi needed to know about the heavenly tribulation, Luo Fan didn't stay any longer. With a slight thought, the fluctuation completely disappeared. He didn't even say his final farewell to Duanshi. The reason for that wasn't because he was too lazy to say anything. It was because he didn't have the right to say a single word at this time. That was because the black hole-like tribulation cloud in the sky had already begun to sense his existence. Grasping the frequency of the fluctuations, it was about to follow the fluctuations to find him, who was in between reality and illusion, and directly transmit its attack to him. Under such circumstances, how could he continue to maintain this fluctuation? One must know that the heavenly tribulation he had encountered during the Broken Era was nothing to him. However, this heavenly tribulation was caused by the heavens and earth. Naturally, it would adjust itself according to the existence it was targeting. For Duanshi, the power of the heavenly tribulation was only at this level. However, if it were to extend into the palace, the power of the heavenly tribulation would no longer be at this level. It might even be possible for it to increase by tens of millions of times, or even billions of times. At that time, perhaps he would be able to resist it, but he would definitely have to pay an extremely great price. Luo Fan did not have the luxury to pay such a price for some nonsense. At this moment, Duanshi seemed to have sensed something. His heart was filled with gratitude towards Luo Fan. Teacher has taken such a huge risk to guide me. I must definitely work hard to get through this tribulation, so as to not let teacher down. Such thoughts flashed through his mind. His expression turned solemn, and the brilliance on his body surged. It suddenly turned into countless lightning bolts that formed a mysterious world around him. At this moment, An indescribable force blasted down from the black, hole-like tribulation clouds. It directly smashed into the world formed by the lightning, causing the world and the force to collapse at the same time. However, shortly after, the world formed by the lightning spun and suddenly sucked in the energy that came crashing down from the tribulation clouds. It fused with the countless energy, and with another spin, it formed the shape of the world once again. It continued to appear around his body and continued to protect his body. Moreover, the world formed by the lightning seemed to be more solid and larger than before. The various laws within it seemed to be more complete. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, had a gratified smile on his face. Countless tiny fragments simultaneously traversed through a strange channel and appeared in his palace before fusing into his body. It was obvious that after destroying the power of the heavenly tribulation, Luo Fan had once again absorbed the fragments that he had split up. After all, the power seemed to have been condensed into a ball and thrown down, but the truth was that its internal structure contained endless, profound mysteries. Even the trajectory of its descent contained endless principles. These naturally contained the mysteries of a cultivation method. Of course, it also included the fragments of Luo Fan that had turned into abstract attributes of the cultivation method. Just now, when this power was crushed and devoured, those abstract attributes were naturally able to break away and then be absorbed by Luo Fan. However, this kind of absorption was much weaker than the heavenly tribulation's method of directly using the traces left behind by Luo Fan to create an attack. After all, if the attack was condensed using the traces left behind by Luo Fan, it would naturally be able to attract more fragments into the attack since it was already resonating with Luo Fan's fragments. Once the attack was shattered, Luo Fan would naturally be able to retrieve more fragments. However, no matter how many fragments there were, as long as the attack continued, Luo Fan would naturally be able to continuously retrieve his fragments. If this continued, he would eventually be able to collect all of his fragments. After receiving Luo Fan's guidance, Duan Shiji's method of dealing with the heavenly tribulation had changed. Currently, he was no longer purely dealing with the attack triggered by the heavenly tribulation. Instead, he had constructed various methods to absorb the power of the heavenly tribulation to strengthen his own methods. He had even comprehended the various mysteries and principles within the heavenly tribulation. He had integrated the mysteries and principles into his body and mind to deepen his understanding of cultivation and raise his cultivation realm. As a result, it became easier for him to deal with the heavenly tribulation. In the beginning, it was still bumpy. Almost every time, he had to pay a considerable price to endure it. However, as time passed, the price he had to pay became less and less. In the end, he did not even have to pay any price at all. Just the defense he built by absorbing the power of the heavenly realm was enough to completely block the heavenly tribulation's attack and even devour it. As a result, Luo Fan, who was in between reality and illusion, naturally obtained more and more benefits. The number of fragments he absorbed also increased, and the entire absorption process became smoother. Time passed second by second during this process. As time passed, the power of the heavenly tribulation also strengthened bit by bit. Unknowingly, another few days had passed. Over the past few days, the entire world had been shaking even more intensely than before. All kinds of tremors appeared in this world at a faster speed than before, and they were constantly transmitted to the senses of all living beings. As the changes intensified, more and more cultivators began to search for the source of the changes. There were so many cultivators in this world, so they naturally had all kinds of strange methods. As a result, even if this location became difficult to find due to the distortion of the heavenly tribulation's power, it would still be discovered by some cultivators. As more and more cultivators learned about it, it would eventually become an open secret. As a result, there were naturally more courageous people who came to this area and began to observe the changes. They wanted to find the source of the turbulence and why it was happening. Under these circumstances, after a few days, there were countless cultivators around this heavenly realm. They were outside this area and used various methods to observe everything, wanting to find out the truth of everything. Among them, some of the methods were too violent, or, in other words, more brilliant, and actually triggered the heavenly tribulation. In the end, they were affected by the aftermath of the heavenly tribulation, and in the end, they were killed by the heavenly tribulation. This change made many cultivators even more curious about what was going on. This was also because the situation in this world had been too peaceful over the past tens of thousands of years. If this happened during the heavenly tribulation, this kind of change would probably cause great panic. Everyone would wonder if this was the start of another heavenly tribulation. At this moment, in the depths of space and time, in the palace that was the ruler of this world, an intense argument broke out. This was the first time this kind of argument had happened since the alliance of the 3,000 cultivators was formed. In the past, even if they disagreed with each other, the cultivators could still restrain themselves from understanding each other and use gentle methods to resolve their differences. This way, there was naturally no need for this kind of argument. However, the situation this time was clearly completely different. This time, the disagreement between the 3,000 cultivators was simply too great. It had even reached a point where it was completely opposite, and it was no longer something that gentle discussions could resolve. In fact, it could even be said that they were only quarreling and not killing each other. This could already be said to be extremely restrained. The thing they were arguing about was none other than how they should deal with Duan Shiji, who was undergoing the heavenly tribulation. One side wanted to help heaven and earth to destroy Duan Shiji completely. The other side wanted to help Duan Shiji overcome the heavenly tribulation. The reason for these two different approaches was very simple. For the cultivators who wanted to help heaven and earth, they believed that Duan Shiji's existence had already affected the balance of this world. He had already caused a riot in this world. If this continued, the next heavenly tribulation would most likely be triggered in advance. It was even possible that several heavenly tribulations would occur at the same time, and in the end, heaven and earth would suffer a disaster. For the cultivators that lived in this world, it was needless to say what choice they should make. For the cultivators who wanted to help Duan Shiji overcome the heavenly tribulation, the reason was not difficult to understand. It was because they believed that since Duan Shiji could affect the balance of this world and cause such a heavenly tribulation to appear to deal with him, it was obvious that he had obtained something that even heaven and earth would be afraid of. If he could help them and wholeheartedly help others overcome the heavenly tribulation, then the continuous heavenly tribulation would not be a problem. Perhaps they could even end the endless heavenly tribulation in advance. These two completely different attitudes could not be reconciled. It was either this or that, and they could not coexist. Because of this, they fell into such a quarrel. As the strongest expert among the 3,000 cultivators, the pinnacle of the sage-to-be was having a headache. He did not participate in the quarrel. Instead, he stood in the middle and hesitated along with a few other cultivators. It was obvious that it was difficult for him to decide what to do with Duan Shiji. In other words, he felt that the attitudes of both sides were reasonable. The quarrel between the 3,000 cultivators became more and more intense. In the end, they could not hold back their power anymore. All sorts of auras were released from their bodies and gradually stirred up the space-time in the hall, causing the hall to be filled with hurricanes. Seeing that they were going to start killing each other regardless of the consequences, the peak quasi-sage knew that he could not allow them to continue like this. If he allowed them to continue like this, the alliance would break apart before they could decide on how to deal with Duan Shiji and the heavenly tribulation. Once this alliance broke apart, it would be a calamity for the entire world. Under such circumstances, he no longer hesitated and directly unleashed his powerful aura. With a sweep of it, all the auras in the entire palace were swept away. The various fluctuations, conflicts, and chaos that were produced by the auras were instantly suppressed, causing the palace to return to its previous tranquil state, as if nothing had happened. Stop! Do you want to erase all your previous efforts for such a trivial matter? The pinnacle quasi-sage shouted coldly. His voice swept through the hall like a piercingly cold wind, invading the minds of all the cultivators in the hall. All of them suddenly woke up from their agitation and showed an indescribable expression of shame. All of a sudden, they realized what they had been doing just now. The cultivators immediately lowered their heads and did not dare to say a word. There's no need to discuss this anymore. We're not going to do anything. If Senior Duan Shiji can survive the heavenly tribulation, it means that he's capable. If he can't, it means that he's useless. We just need to prepare for the next heavenly tribulation, the peak quasi-sage said after taking a deep breath. Hearing this, everyone's faces were filled with dissatisfaction. Chapter 2344. For a time, the crowd's emotions were surging. Each and every one of them expressed that this choice was unacceptable. This choice could not be any worse. If they were to make such a choice, they might as well make the choice that the other camp had suggested. The peak quasi-sage had clearly expected such an attitude from the crowd. He sneered and released his aura. The aura filled the entire hall and enveloped all the cultivators. With a single tremor, all the cultivators felt fear from the bottom of their hearts. All of a sudden, all the cultivators woke up from their dissatisfaction. They suddenly realized what kind of existence they had been questioning and why they had been courting death just now. In an instant, the entire hall fell silent. Even the sound of breathing had disappeared. I'm not asking for your opinion right now. This is the final decision. If you're dissatisfied, you can challenge me. As long as you can win, I'll listen to you, the peak quasi-sage said. Hearing this, all of the cultivators became dispirited. Although they had formed a complete organization for so many years and had cooperated with each other for so many times, there were so many arguments and compromises in the past, but there was still a gap between their strength. The difference in status brought about by the difference in strength was also irreparable. Under normal circumstances, when the peak quasi-sage didn't show his strength, they could question and refute him at will. However, when the peak quasi-sage displayed his strength and used it to oppress them, they could only listen to him obediently, even if they were extremely dissatisfied. At this moment, the 3,000 cultivators didn't say a word and looked like they had turned into clay statues. Seeing how the crowd had turned out, the peak quasi-sage knew that his violence had planted a hidden danger in the future. The peaceful and orderly atmosphere that he had deliberately created previously would no longer exist from now on. However, even though he knew this, he did not regret using force to suppress the differences between the two sides. After all, only when he had reached his current cultivation level did he realize the difference between him and Duan Shi. He also realized how insignificant his 3,000 cultivators were compared to Duan Shi. If they were to participate in the heavenly tribulation that Duan Sheng and he had encountered, it would be like a group of ants participating in the battle between two huge dragons. If either of them paid attention to him, they would definitely die without a burial place. Not even a trace of them would be left behind after understanding this. How could he participate in it? However, how could he explain these words to that cultivator? Could it be that what we're discussing now is nothing more than ants discussing which side to help when they see two dragons fighting? He was indeed happy to say this, but what about the morale of the cultivators? If he said that, the confidence of the 3,000 cultivators would be completely destroyed. As for the tribulation that would soon appear and spread throughout the entire world, the chances of them surviving would be even slimmer. In contrast, using such a forceful method to suppress the differences between the cultivators and the cultivators might seem like a hidden danger. However, it could maintain their confidence and increase their chances of surviving the tribulation. It was precisely because of this consideration that he didn't regret his decision, even though he knew that it would cause hidden dangers. While the 3,000 cultivators were arguing, there was a strange being that was eyeing the heavenly tribulation covetously somewhere in the world. It was an abyss. The abyss was located in the southwest of this world. In other words, it was in the southwest of the central continent, in the depths of the southern wilderness where there weren't many people. There weren't any traces of civilization within a range of billions of miles. There were only countless demonic beasts, divine beasts, and demonic beasts. There were also various cultivators who couldn't survive in the civilized areas of the central continent. In the depths of this barren land, there was an extremely deep abyss. It was said that this abyss led to the end of the world. Ever since it was discovered, no living beings that had entered it had ever come out. At this moment, there were thousands of strange living beings in the depths of the abyss. Those strange living beings seemed to be humans and beasts at the same time. They had all sorts of strange appearances, but they didn't seem to have a fixed pattern. Or rather, they didn't have a fixed template. These living beings with different appearances had one thing in common, and that was that their eyes contained an extremely stubborn aura of destruction. It was as if they were born for the sake of destruction. For the sake of destruction. Their ultimate goal, their greatest achievement, was to completely destroy everything. Those living beings were none other than the marks of the chaos creatures that had returned from reincarnation. At this moment, compared to the previous generation, these creatures were much more intelligent and much more restrained. In the past, these living beings would definitely start to destroy the surroundings as soon as they were born. In the end, they would be killed, imprisoned, and forced to submit until the tribulation arrived. There were simply too many of these living beings, and the other living beings couldn't resist them at all. Only when they could no longer resist would they gather together and start to destroy the foundation of this world. However, these living beings were clearly completely different now. They had even established an organization that was completely opposite to the 3,000 cultivators. And this abyss was their organization's headquarters. The thousands of living beings in the abyss were the organization's supreme leaders. This abyss was indeed like the legends said. It led straight to the end of the world. At the bottom of the abyss, there was a boundary between heaven and earth and the chaotic state of the outside world. It was like the place where Duanji was born and the place where the emperor received the information left behind by the true saint. The only difference was that due to the special structure of this abyss, traces of chaos aura constantly seeped out from below and filled the entire abyss. It constantly affected everything that entered the abyss, including living beings. When other living beings entered the abyss, they would naturally be affected by the endless chaos aura and be eroded. In the end, they would lose control of themselves and fall into the abyss's depths. They would enter the boundary between heaven and earth and chaos aura and eventually become a part of it, disappearing without a trace. That was the fundamental reason why the living beings that entered the abyss could not return to the outside. On the other hand, the living beings that carried the chaos aura were different. The brand they carried came from the primal chaos. This brand wasn't destroyed when they encountered the aura of the primal chaos. Instead, it started to absorb this information and make up for the damage the brand had suffered in the reincarnation of this world. In this way, not only would they not feel any danger or discomfort in the abyss, but they would also feel unprecedentedly safe and comfortable. After the imprints that came from the chaos aura absorbed the endless chaos aura, they naturally grew and began to strengthen continuously. As a result of this strengthening, the strength of these living beings would be greatly elevated, of course. There were also some small side effects after absorbing the chaos aura. That was, the appearance of these living beings would change along with the changes. In fact, when these living beings reincarnated, most of them would actually become the appearance of the world's natural Tao bodies. In other words, they would have 3 eyes and 4 elbows. The reason why it had turned into such a strange state was because it had absorbed the endless chaotic aura. Here's our chance. Among the many living beings, a creature that looked like the fusion of a wild boar and a python spoke. That voice was extremely strange. It was deep and hoarse, and vaguely, there seemed to be countless strange noises contained in that voice. What chance? Another living being spoke, not far away. It looked like a creature that was the fusion of a pheasant, a fish, and a lizard. It looked even uglier than the creature that was the fusion of a wild boar and a python. Its voice was also extremely unpleasant to the ears. Just hearing it was enough to make one's entire body numb. and all sorts of uncomfortable feelings arose spontaneously in one's heart. That person has clearly betrayed this world, which is why he was punished by the world. Perhaps we can pull him over and have him join our side. When that time comes, we won't have to worry about being sent into the reincarnation cycle again and again. The creature that spoke first was extremely pleased with itself. Upon hearing this, the other living beings' eyes lit up. To creatures like them who already possessed intelligence and reason, they had already understood from the very beginning that their fates were actually to be sent into reincarnation time and time again by the world. In the end, they would be completely digested by the world and would only stop when they lost all of their sense of self. Under such circumstances, as intelligent creatures, how could they be willing to suffer such a fate? How could they watch helplessly as they were destroyed time and time again? Of course, they wanted to do everything they could to break free and obtain freedom. In fact, this organization was established because of this. However, even though this organization was established, they wanted to save as many of their companions as possible and give themselves a greater chance of survival. In fact, they knew very well that the possibility of them breaking free from fate and transcending the shackles was extremely small. In other words, it was almost impossible for them to succeed in their pursuit. What they were doing now was actually just a desperate struggle. In the end, it was hard to say how much effect they could achieve, how many benefits they could obtain, and how long they could live. At this moment, when the creatures heard this possibility, their eyes lit up. They looked at that creature as if they were looking at a god that had come to their rescue. Is that really possible? That person was the great emperor back then. Yes, he killed our main force. One of the creatures said. Upon hearing this, the creature that seemed to be a fusion of a wild boar and a python laughed. That's exactly why it's possible. As the ruler of the previous tribulations, he actually committed a crime against the heavens and was subjected to the tribulations by the world. This is clearly a sin that this world cannot make up for. In fact, compared to us, he might even be feared by this world. In that case, we're willing to accept him, and he should even be deeply grateful. How could he possibly refuse? Although these creatures looked extremely hideous, they were, after all, chaos creatures. Their imprints had been made up for and even strengthened. Therefore, they were much more knowledgeable about the reincarnation of living beings compared to ordinary creatures. Ordinary people could not tell what Duan Sheng's past life was. Even if they could only make guesses about it. However, to them, the connection between Duan Sheng and the Great Emperor was as obvious as reading a book on a palm. At a glance, they could see the similarities between their imprints. Under such circumstances, they naturally assumed that Duanshi and the Great Monarch were the same person. Then what are we waiting for? Let's move quickly. From the looks of it, he most likely won't make it. At this moment, another creature hurriedly cried out. He's not going to make it? How is he not going to make it? Another creature asked in confusion. Isn't that obvious? He might seem to have the upper hand now, but don't forget how we were like back then. Once you're targeted by this world, the stronger your performance, the stronger the attacks you'll face. Now that he's acting like this, it's obvious that this world is going to make its move soon. The creature that answered was extremely proud. Oh, I see. You're really wise. The doubtful creature came to a sudden realization. Hearing this, the creature from before was incredibly pleased. It continued, Of course, I've died more than 10 times. I'm the most experienced one in this regard. The other living beings all looked at this being with admiration in their eyes, and this made him even more pleased with himself. No, let's wait a little longer. The imprints on our bodies are still too weak. We don't have as much power as we did in our past lives. If we go like this, we won't be able to save him at all. Instead, we'll lose our lives, said the creature that seemed to have merged with a boar and a python. Judging from its reaction, it obviously did not think that there was anything wrong with what the other creatures said. On the contrary, it agreed with their judgment. It was just that its judgment of timing was slightly different from the other creatures. Chapter 23:45. The living beings with marks of chaos creatures were arguing noisily at this moment, and all of them seemed rather optimistic. They were optimistic about the prospect of Duanshi joining them, This alliance, formed by living beings with marks of chaos creatures, corresponded to the alliance formed by the 3,000 cultivators. For the alliance formed by the 3,000 cultivators, their goal was to help this world survive the repeated tribulations so that more living beings could survive each tribulation. However, for the alliance formed by the strange creatures in this abyss, their goal was to cause the greatest damage to this world during the repeated tribulations, and at the same time, to ensure that they could survive as much as possible. From a certain aspect, these living beings were already fundamentally different from the chaos creatures in the past. After all, for those chaos creatures, although the desire to survive as much as possible existed, they couldn't break through the influence of the impulse to destroy and couldn't change the way they destroyed everything. All of a sudden, one of the strange creatures said, "Perhaps we should shift our attention from that person to something else." This strange creature seemed to be half a bird and half an insect, and it wasn't the kind that was separated from the top and the bottom, but the kind that was separated from the left and the right. Even in this place where there were many strange creatures, this strange creature seemed to be particularly strange. At the very least, the other strange creatures around it seemed to look down on it and vaguely felt that they weren't the ugliest because it was at the bottom. What does that mean? Is there something more important now? The other creatures were bewildered and didn't know what this creature meant. After all, in their opinion, the addition of the Emperor could almost increase their chances of survival by more than 10 times. In comparison, was there anything else that could compare to this? Since there wasn't, what else could be more important than this? The half-bird, half-insect creature remained unmoved at this moment. It only said, "We come from chaos, but part of our nature has actually been assimilated by this world. In this way, we are actually somewhat similar to some living beings in this world. Haven't you noticed?" Upon hearing this, the other living beings looked at each other. In the end, the living being said, "You're talking about those living beings that were born at the border of the world? That's not all. There are also those who were sent into the cycle of reincarnation and reincarnated in the central continent. The living beings from the border of this world," the half-bird, half-insect creature said. "What are you trying to say?" One of the strange creatures asked in a displeased manner. Hearing this, the half-bird, half-insect creature sneered and said, "Don't you think that their similarities to us are a little strange?" "Wait, I kind of understand what you mean," the creature that looked like a fusion between a boar and a python said with a flash of inspiration. All of the other living beings couldn't help but cast their gazes toward this being from all directions. Compared to the half-bird, half-insect creature, this creature was clearly more recognized by the other creatures. They were more inclined to his judgment. This was the benefit of being active before. The half-bird, half-insect creature was quite displeased by this, but it did not say anything. After all, this wasn't something that could be changed by his attitude. "You're saying that they might be able to be strengthened here like us, change, and eventually become a part of us?" The creature that was a fusion between a boar and a python said. Upon hearing this, the half-bird, half-insect creature nodded and said, "That's right. They were born from the border of this world and should have changed under the influence of chaos. To a certain extent, they could also be considered as chaos creatures. It's just that their portion that belongs to chaos is countless times less than ours." Good. We must pull them over. That's right. We must pull them over. Their numbers aren't any less than ours. If we can obtain their replenishment, our strength will increase by at least a few times. That's right. All of the living beings began to clamor incessantly, making the place appear to be in an uproar. This seemingly dark abyss actually seemed to be extraordinarily lively at this moment. At the same time, the aura of chaos released from the depths of the abyss below seemed to have strengthened a little. Even the chaos at the border seemed to be surging more intensely. At this moment, in an unknown distance away, Duan Shi, who was undergoing his heavenly tribulation, sensed that the heavenly tribulation seemed to have undergone some subtle changes. All of a sudden, the heavenly tribulation seemed to have broken its original stability. Instead, it began to gradually rise, gradually pushing its power to a higher level. What's going on? Facing this sudden change, he couldn't help but feel a little surprised. One must know that although the heavenly tribulation had lasted for a long time, the level of the heavenly tribulation had been maintained at a stable level since a certain period of time. This was also the reason why he was able to hold on even though he was in a sorry state. After that, he received pointers from his teacher and found a way to convert the power of the heavenly tribulation into his own strength. With that, it became easier for him to deal with the heavenly tribulation. Under the attacks of the heavenly tribulation, he even had the time to comprehend the various marks and wonders contained within. But now, he felt that the pressure from the heavenly tribulation was getting stronger. In a trance, he had a feeling that he was gradually being suppressed. Vaguely, there was an inexplicable frenzy coming from the heavenly tribulation. Of course, the frenzy wasn't strong. On the contrary, it was rather weak. If one wasn't careful, it would be overlooked. I must be mistaken. In the end, Duan sure wasn't as confident as Luo Fan. At this moment, he shook his head and tossed the ridiculous feeling out of his head. After all, the heavenly tribulation came from heaven and earth. If the heavenly tribulation transmitted a frenzy, didn't that mean that heaven and earth had become frenzied? But how was that possible? This was a perfect heaven and earth, a perfect existence that even gave birth to a true saint. How could such an existence become frenzied because of anything? If he felt that heaven and earth had become frenzied, then there must be something wrong with his senses with that thought in mind. He tossed the feeling out of his head and focused on dealing with the waves of tribulations that were crashing down from above. At this moment, in the palace that existed between reality and illusion, Luo Fan wasn't as careless as Duan Sure. At this moment, his eyes flickered as though he could see through the endless distance and obstacles to see all the mysteries and secrets of the universe. There's actually such a change. It seems like this great tribulation's compliance with the rules is beyond my imagination. Such a thought flashed through his mind, and he looked a little excited. What kind of existence was he? Even if heaven and earth directly targeted him, he could still escape and hide in a place where heaven and earth couldn't do anything to him for so many years. It couldn't be any easier for him to deduce the reason behind some phenomena. Just now, when the heavenly tribulation that Duan Sure encountered slightly changed, he had already deduced the source of the change and deduced everything that was happening in the depths of the wildlands in the southwest. He also understood why heaven and earth had become frenzied because of that. The reason why heaven and earth left behind the imprints of the chaos creatures was to assimilate the imprints through the repeated tribulations, and in the end, turn everything from the chaos creatures into its own. In the end, it would strengthen itself and sublimate itself. Under such circumstances, the living beings formed from the imprints of the chaos creatures actually wanted to imprint the aura of chaos on the living beings that were already a part of heaven and earth and turn them into chaos creatures. This was simply equivalent to cutting out one's own flesh and feeding it to oneself. One could well imagine how unbearable this was for the world. It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that the emotions of heaven and earth were completely different from those of ordinary living beings, heaven and earth would have directly sent a shocking tribulation to completely wipe out all the living beings in the abyss. How could it only be a little frenzied? Through this change, Luo Fan also discovered something that he had already discovered before but didn't pay much attention to. That was, this great tribulation's compliance with the rules was far beyond his imagination. After all, although Luo Fan had stayed in this world for a long time and planned for a long time, he had never forgotten that he was currently in the midst of his sixth great tribulation. This world, the chaotic state outside heaven and earth, and even the traces left behind by the true saints, everything was merely created by this great tribulation. However, the existences that were created by this great tribulation were carrying out such an intense conflict according to their own characteristics and standpoints. The schemes between them had actually reached such a point where they would not stop until one of them died, and even gave Luo Fan so many opportunities to make use of them. One could imagine how strong the implementation of the rules was. But this is also normal, right? If I don't have such an opportunity, how can I have a chance to survive the absolute suppression of all the powers in the Great Tribulation? If that's really the case, then it's not a heavenly tribulation, but a divine retribution. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he felt a lot more relaxed. He felt that the countless pressures that had been pressing down on his heart had suddenly relaxed a lot, and the slim chance of transcending had suddenly increased by who knew how many times. Since that's the case, I'll help you guys. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he casually pointed with his finger, and specks of spiritual light pierced through the barrier between the illusory and the real. They pierced through the boundless space-time and boundless obstructions, directly arriving in the abyss and entering the head of the creature that looked like a fusion between a wild boar and a python. As these spots of spiritual light fused into the head, the creature trembled slightly and suddenly felt that its mind had become much clearer. Countless inspirations appeared in its heart out of nowhere, making it feel as if everything before its eyes had suddenly become clear. Many of the problems that gave it headaches were solved at this moment, and they became extremely simple. It was as if he could see through everything at a glance and know all the causes and effects. So that's how it should be. So it's this simple. Why didn't I think of this before? It murmured, causing many creatures to cast strange gazes at it from all directions. After all, it was behaving too strangely at this moment. This narcissistic attitude was something that had never been seen in any living creature of their kind. In the face of such strange gazes, the creature that looked like the fusion of a wild boar and a python did not care at all. At this moment, it just constantly rethought its plan and carried out all sorts of complicated deductions. It didn't take long for it to recover from its shock, and it said, "I already know what I should do. All of you must firmly remember what I'm going to say next. Otherwise, if something goes wrong, then it won't just be the grand event that will be affected. Even your lives will be lost because of it." This kind of attitude had never appeared before. In the past, although this creature was acknowledged by many other creatures, they only agreed with some of its views. At the end of the day, their statuses were still equal. At the very least, they were probably equal. However, this creature was clearly putting itself in an extremely high position. It was treating all of them as its subordinates, and all of them as targets that it could order around. How could other creatures get used to this? Normally, these creatures might have turned hostile because of this attitude, and they would have taught this boar and python creature a lesson. However, at this moment, they could faintly feel an indescribable pressure coming from this living being. They did not dare to speak or refute him. In fact, they even instinctively wanted to follow everything this living being said and instinctively submit to him. This feeling made all the living beings present feel rather uncomfortable. However, for some reason, none of them dared to voice out their discomfort. All of them actually agreed in a stern manner. When they agreed to it, they felt as if the uncomfortable feeling had been vented, and their bodies felt relaxed. Chapter 2346. Before these creatures could come to a conclusion, the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python had already issued an order. According to his arrangements, almost all of the living beings here had their own tasks to fulfill. Their mission was not to leave the abyss in such a violent manner and search for creatures born at the boundary of this world to join them. Instead, they would use various mysterious methods to activate a certain essence in themselves and use some mysterious channel to resonate with creatures that had the same characteristics as them. Then, all sorts of mysterious information would be transmitted to the hearts of those creatures through this resonance, causing them to draw closer to this place on their own. This method had completely subverted the limits of those creatures' imagination. After hearing this, they could not help but be dumbfounded. They looked at the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python with incomparable admiration. One must know that the method that they originally thought of was at most to use some method to hide themselves and leave the abyss to search for those creatures. That way, although they could achieve their goal, their safety could not be guaranteed. Not to mention anything else, they were definitely the enemies of all creatures in this world. With this identity, there was almost a 90% chance that they would come into conflict with other creatures. Not to mention the fact that they were faintly rejected by the world, which meant that their luck was extremely bad. As they walked in this world, they might encounter an accident every few steps. Although it wasn't fatal to them, it was definitely a huge problem. It was enough to make them have a hard time completing their mission. Perhaps a mission that could be completed in a few days might take a few months. Now, if they followed the words of the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python, they did not need to leave the abyss at all. They did not need to meet others, and they did not need to face the accidents that were watching them covetously all the time. They only needed to circulate their power here and activate their essence to complete their goal. It went without saying that the difficulty was much lower than they had imagined. How could they not be excited? How could they not worship the existence that found this method? Before, they still wanted to oppose this creature and maintain their dignity and status. Now, even the most stubborn creatures acknowledged the status of the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python. They acknowledged that it had the right to command all of them. As these arrangements were carried out, the living beings began to take action one by one. In the blink of an eye, invisible ripples began to radiate from these creatures. They extended downwards and gradually fused with the chaotic aura. Then, through the chaotic aura, they reached the boundary between the world and the chaotic world. Using the various existences at the boundary as a medium, they began to spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, they had spread across the entire world. These fluctuations were extremely profound. Every single fluctuation contained the essence of a chaotic being, and all of them were extremely stubborn and strangely stable. Nothing could stop their transmission, and nothing could cause any damage to them. To ordinary objects, this kind of fluctuation had no sense of existence. However, to the living beings that were born at the border of the world, this fluctuation was like the light that they yearned for, the light that they were summoned by. It made them feel extremely comfortable and satisfied. All of a sudden, those creatures began to pursue these waves of energy on their own, trying their best to fuse these waves of energy into their own bodies, into the depths of their life source. As these changes occurred, the countless living beings that were scattered across the world began to riot. All sorts of terrifying power began to spread everywhere. Space and time were shattered piece by piece. These fluctuations continued to seep into the bodies of these living beings and fuse with their minds. They began to transmit all sorts of indescribable information to their hearts, making them suddenly understand many things that they had never understood before. So I'm different from them. As these thoughts appeared in the hearts of these living beings, the way they looked at other living beings began to change. An indescribably firm will begin to change their mentality, causing them to involuntarily head southwest. They were heading toward the abyss in the depths of the wasteland. They already knew that only here was their source, and only here could they find their own kind. Only here could they find their future. These fluctuations were emitted by the living beings in the abyss, so they could naturally sense the feedback coming from all directions through these fluctuations. At this moment, when those living beings took action, they all sensed it through the fluctuations they emitted. At this moment, the abyss was filled with thunderous cheers. We finally succeeded. I didn't expect it to be so easy. I think you can be the Alliance Master, one of the living beings said to the boar python-like creature. Hearing this, the creature that seemed to be a fusion of boar and python did not look pleased at all. There was only a domineering air about it, as if it believed that no one else was qualified to be the leader of the alliance other than itself. The gazes of the other living beings changed. Some were in awe, some were in shock, some were dissatisfied, but most of them were in agreement. In an instant, the crowd's emotions surged. Each and every one of them agreed with the creature's words and pushed the creature, who was like a fusion between a wild boar and a python, to be the leader of the alliance. Although some of the other living beings opposed this decision, they were also interested in the position of Alliance Master. Perhaps it could be said that they were also interested in the position of Alliance Leader, But with the approval of the majority of the living beings, their objections were clearly ineffective. It didn't take long for an unprecedented leader to appear in the organization, someone who was acknowledged by all living beings. After the appearance of this alliance master, the unity of the entire alliance began to increase greatly. The entire alliance seemed to have grown from a pile of loose sand into a complete, inseparable entity. Only now do I feel like we have a chance at victory, a creature that appeared to be quite old said. Its words contained an indescribable emotion and joy, as if it had finally grasped a bit of light in the boundless darkness. Hearing this, the other living beings could not help but feel bewildered. What do you mean? Did we not have a chance at victory at all? After all, many living beings here felt that joining the alliance would bring them hope of victory, allowing them to survive in the battle against the world, which was why they had joined. Previously, they were extremely confident about this. They felt that even if the other living beings died, they would still be able to survive. They would still be able to recover their chaos creature imprints and become chaos creatures again. But now, hearing the old man's words, it seemed like they had no hope at all. Everything they felt before was just an illusion. So how could they not be shocked? Hearing this, the old man sneered and said, "Could it be that you have never thought about who our opponents are? It's just a world that was born not long ago. What's the big deal? Who knows how many worlds we've destroyed in the state of chaos?" One of the living beings said in disdain, "That's our predecessors, not us. Moreover, even our previous selves failed in the face of this world," the old man said. Hearing this, the scene fell silent. All the living beings stopped their disdain and clamor. They floated there in a daze and did not know what to do. They could use all sorts of opinions to cover up this fact before, but now that the old man reminded them, all their disguises disappeared. They finally realized what the truth was. They were merely living beings formed from the remnants of the chaos imprints left behind by the chaos creatures after their deaths. They did not have the power of the chaos creature imprints from before at all. To be able to retain even 1% or 1/1000% of its power was already a lot, and it was extremely unbelievable. Facing such a huge world, it went without saying what their chances of winning were. Not to mention that even their predecessors, the chaos creature imprints that were hundreds or even thousands of times stronger than them, had died before this world and were completely destroyed by it, leaving only their imprints. Under such circumstances, did they really have a chance of winning against this world? For a moment, an indescribable sense of panic appeared in their hearts. Even the little chance of winning that the old man had judged seemed to no longer be credible. Even if we unite, can we really win? Can we really survive the attack of this world? This was the thought that appeared in their minds. With this thought in mind, the scene became serious. All the living beings' gazes became erratic, and none of them dared to look at the old man. The old man sneered when he saw this and said, "What? Is everyone afraid now? Have you all lost confidence? Where did your arrogance go?" Upon hearing this, the many living beings fell silent. After a long while, one of them finally said, "Didn't you say it? Our current opponents are simply too powerful. Even if we unite, our strength hasn't increased by much. Could it be that we can really win against such powerful opponents?" Upon hearing this, although the other living beings did not speak, they all seemed to agree with this. The old man sneered and turned his gaze to the boar python-like living being that had also fallen into silence. Looking at its solemn gaze, he felt somewhat comforted. At the very least, this living being that was pushed to be the leader of the alliance did not lose confidence completely. If it lost confidence too, what awaited them would really be hopeless darkness. At that moment, it said, "It's normal for all of you to have such thoughts. In fact, I'm even more delighted that all of you have such thoughts than before when you were full of confidence. What thoughts do you have? Hurry up and say it. Why are you keeping us in suspense now?" The boar python-like living being said. It had an impression of this old man. He was someone who had also survived the previous calamity like it. Moreover, the last time it saw it, it seemed to have lived for a very long time already. However, it had always been extremely low-key, as if it was an invisible creature and did not express its opinion on anything. In fact, it was quite surprised that it participated in the establishment of this alliance. For such a living being to express its opinion at a time like this was something worth paying attention to. The old man looked at the boar python-like living being and said plainly, "Of course I have some thoughts. In fact, if all of us unite, our strength will increase by more than 10,000 times." Upon hearing this, the many living beings could not help but gasp. 10,000 times? This multiple was not a simple number. None of the living beings dared to believe this multiple. "No way. How can it be 10,000 times?" One of the living beings retorted. "Whether it's possible or not, we'll know in the future. However, this multiple isn't the source of my information," the old man said. The other living beings were even more dumbfounded at this moment. Increasing one's strength by 10,000 times was already very exaggerated. Who would have thought that this wasn't the source of the old man's confidence? Could it be that there was something else that they had overlooked? What do you mean by that? The boar and python-fused creature couldn't remain calm and hurriedly asked. "What I mean is very simple. It's you," the old man said. All the other living beings couldn't help but turn their gazes to the Alliance Master from all directions. In other words, this creature that looked like a fusion between a wild boar and a python. At this moment, their gazes toward the Alliance Master became somewhat strange. There seemed to be some desire, some anticipation, some surprise, some doubt, and some shock. "There's nothing different." Finally, one of the living beings voiced out what all the living beings were thinking. The other living beings nodded involuntarily. In their eyes, the creature before them did not seem any different from before. Apart from the title of Alliance Master on its head, that was all. But that was all. Apart from this intangible difference, what else was there? At that moment, all the living beings couldn't help but wonder if the old man was trying to trick them or if he was trying to build up support for the Alliance Master. Chapter 23:47. While the other creatures made random guesses, the boar python creature was even more bewildered. "What on earth do you know?" it asked the old man coldly. The old man looked at the creature indifferently. His eyes seemed to be able to penetrate all barriers, all appearances, and directly see all the secrets hidden in the creature's body. Being stared at by such a gaze, even though this creature was a combination of a wild boar and a python, it couldn't help but feel strangely nervous, as if it was really hiding some secret. As soon as such a feeling appeared, it instantly shook its head and got rid of it, because it clearly remembered everything about itself. It did not have the secret that the other creatures thought it had. "Because you have the favor of a natural enemy," the old man said flatly. "Natural enemy? Ridiculous. What natural enemy do we have? If we have a natural enemy, why would it favor us, since it is our natural enemy?" The other creatures were both shocked and angry. This was a matter of principle. The existence of a natural enemy was a matter of life and death for any kind of living creature. If such a creature did not know that it had a natural enemy, it would be even worse. Obviously, to those creatures, the old man's words meant that they had a natural enemy that they did not know about. This meant that they might have wandered around the gates of hell countless times. How could they not be shocked? At this time, the old man shook his head and said, "This natural enemy is not that natural enemy. This natural enemy is the enemy of heaven and earth, the enemy of the world." Hearing this, many living beings secretly heaved sighs of relief. At the same time, they looked at the creature that seemed to be a fusion between a boar and a python in astonishment. It was better if it had such a natural enemy. However, this also raised another question. When did this creature, which was a combination of a wild boar and a python, gain the favor of its natural enemy? Could it be that it had gained some benefits from that existence? For a moment, many people's eyes were filled with doubt. The boar python creature was shocked and angry at this time. "Why don't I know that I have gotten the favor of a natural enemy? If you don't tell me everything, today will be the day you die." The aura on his body surged, and a tremendous aura began to be released in all directions. The abyss seemed to have turned into a piece of paper under the impact of his aura. forming all sorts of indescribable distortions. The distortions continued to spread in all directions from where he was, causing all the living beings in the abyss to feel an indescribable pressure on their souls, causing them to tremble uncontrollably. It's so powerful. Such astonishment emerged in the hearts of many creatures. It had to be known that although the wild boar and python's fusion was somewhat outstanding, it was more in terms of intelligence. In terms of strength, it didn't have much of an astonishing performance. However, at this moment, when this creature unleashed its power without restraint, they came to a sudden realization. It turned out that this creature had been restraining itself all along. It turned out that the gap between them was actually so huge. For a moment, many creatures could not help but tremble. At this time, the old man was not affected by the momentum at all. He quietly hovered there, and his body seemed to have completely integrated into the abyss. No matter how the momentum washed over him, there was no change in him at all. Aren't you surprised? Why did you suddenly become so clear-headed and understand so many things that you did not know before? The old man said flatly. Following this, the boar python creature shuddered. It instinctively wanted to deny it, but it suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of awkwardness in its heart. The old man's words also unknowingly seeped into its heart, gradually evoking all kinds of strangeness that it had involuntarily ignored before. Indeed, its previous performance was indeed a little exaggerated. With its original ability and intelligence, it seemed almost impossible for it to think of all that before. However, in reality, it had indeed thought of all this before. It had indeed thought of the safest, most convenient, and fastest method to summon the creature that was born at the border of heaven and earth. And when it recalled this, under normal circumstances, even if it had thought of this idea, it would probably have needed thousands or even tens of thousands of years to be able to perfect this idea and create the required method. However, just now, with just a thought, the entire process was directly skipped. This situation was strange no matter how one looked at it, and there seemed to be a secret no matter how one looked at it. With this thought, the terrifying momentum that was continuously released from its body began to gradually withdraw. The various changes in the abyss also gradually disappeared, and all the strange scenes completely returned to normal. Could it be that this is the so-called method of the so-called natural enemy? It murmured. That's right. Only a great existence that can go against heaven and earth can use a method that none of us understand to make you understand these things. As the old man spoke, his eyes became slightly fanatical. It looked at the creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python, as if it could directly see an incomparably huge and incomparably majestic figure hidden behind it. All sorts of thoughts flashed through the mind of the creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python. Countless flashes of light flashed through its mind, and the light of wisdom was continuously stimulated as it tried its best to deduce and search according to the old man's thoughts. In the end, it had to admit that perhaps the possibility that the old man had mentioned was the only possibility that could have led to this result. After understanding this, it could not help but smile bitterly. I originally thought that my potential was stimulated, but I didn't expect the truth to be like this. It was like a person who originally thought that he had become the richest person in the world with his own strength, only to find out in the end that the money that made him the richest person in the world was actually transferred to him by his own family using a secret method. It was self-evident how much of a blow that was. In this way, when he looked at his previous self that was full of confidence, he would definitely feel that he was no different from a clown back then. At this time, the many creatures finally reacted. Perhaps things were a little different from what they had previously thought. Perhaps there really was a so-called natural enemy. For a moment, they were both horrified and delighted. They were horrified that such a great enemy actually existed in this world, and they who thought that they were the masterminds behind this world actually didn't know about it until now. Needless to say, there was no need to talk about joy. They were originally helpless and could only rely on themselves to struggle for a little bit of survival. But now, they discovered that there was actually such a great existence in their camp that they could rely on. How could they not be surprised? How should we seize this bit of hope? The creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python said at this time. At this time, it had truly admitted that the old man in front of it, who had obviously lived longer than it had in terms of knowledge and experience. Wait. The old man smiled faintly. Wait. The creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python thought of many possible answers, but did not expect that the answer it received would be this one. After all, logically speaking, if one saw a certain possibility or a certain opportunity, of course one would do their best to expand this possibility and seize this opportunity. Quietly standing here and waiting for an opportunity to arrive should be viewed as a negative attitude, no matter what level and perspective one was from. It should even be used as a counterexample to warn the world. However, at this moment, this existence that he had just acknowledged to be more knowledgeable than him actually made this choice so openly. How could he not be surprised? That's right, wait. How can we fathom such a great existence like the natural enemy? Any of our actions could possibly anger him and cause him to lose his favor towards you. On the contrary, waiting here and doing things according to his arrangements is the most likely choice to maintain his favor. The old man said faintly. Hearing this, the boar python creature, who was also the leader of the entire alliance, nodded in disbelief, even though he didn't think that this was the best way to go about things. Although it did not think that this was the best method, it did not think of any other method that would be more reliable than this. Therefore, it could only obediently do as it said. At this moment, a creature exclaimed, "It arrived so quickly." This voice attracted the attention of other creatures, causing them to shift their gazes from the old man or the leader to the outside of the abyss, to the direction that had triggered the creature's astonishment. It was none other than a creature with the characteristics of a chaotic creature that was crossing the boundary and charging toward the barren land where the abyss was located. It was so fast that it was astounding. Judging from the looks of it, that creature had already rushed over to this abyss as fast as it could after receiving their guidance. When all the creatures turned their gazes and finally discovered the creature, it had already crossed time and space and arrived above the abyss. This creature had the appearance of the world's connate Taoism aptitude. In other words, it was the appearance of the countless creatures deep in the abyss before they absorbed the chaotic aura. This was the external appearance of being assimilated by the world, and it was also an image that was rejected by the many creatures inside. At this moment, the creature hovered above the abyss, but its heart sank into hesitation. The abyss below looked incomparably strange, as if it contained infinite danger and infinite misfortune. Entering it seemed like an extremely foolish idea. However, from the resonance that he had received, entering the abyss represented a new life, a breakthrough, and liberation. This intuitive understanding conflicted with the information he received in his heart, making him unable to make a decision at the moment. At this moment, the creatures in the abyss below were extremely anxious, and they wanted nothing more than to rush out and pull him down. However, they knew that they absolutely could not do such a thing at this moment. This was because if they did that, the world would instantly discover their existence. Perhaps it would directly transfer the great calamity to the abyss and destroy them. After all, their previous actions had clearly triggered some sort of reaction from the world. The reason why this reaction had not turned into various attacks was only because the abyss was filled with chaotic aura. From a certain perspective, it did not belong to this world. Once they left the abyss and the chaotic aura, the world would definitely be able to immediately connect the various phenomena from before with them. Then it would transfer countless attacks over and completely wipe them out. As such, although all the creatures were extremely anxious, none of them dared to go out and pull that creature down. Fortunately, since that creature could rush over so quickly, it was obvious that it had already made up its mind. At this time, it only struggled internally for a while before it erased all kinds of distracting thoughts. It made up its mind and rushed straight into the abyss below. In the blink of an eye, It had already crossed the boundary between the abyss and the barbarian land, and disappeared into the boundless darkness. As he entered the darkness, endless chaotic aura wrapped around him and started invading his body. At this moment, the creature felt endless pain radiating from its body. Amidst this pain, his body started to corrode and melt. Soon after, he started to gradually disintegrate. In contrast to this change, his life imprint in the depths of his soul was like dew after a long drought. It started to frantically absorb the chaotic aura and tried its best to fuse this aura into its body. It tried its best to activate and even strengthen the characteristics of the chaos creature imprint that had almost disappeared in its body. The pain of his physical body and the joy and the satisfaction emitted by the life imprint intertwined, forming an extremely strange feeling. This caused the creature's expression to become extremely strange. After an unknown period of time, when the creature felt that all the changes had calmed down, its figure had completely changed. From its original appearance of 3 eyes and 4 elbows, it had turned into an image that looked like an ant and a scorpion that had twisted and fused together in an extremely strange way. He has become it, and this incomparably ugly image at this moment in its heart was actually so natural, so beautiful, as if this should be his true image, his true body. Chapter 2348. On this side, the living beings with the mark of chaos were working hard to expand their forces. On the other side, Era of Destruction was in the midst of its greatest crisis. At this moment, he was trying his best to convert the power of the heaven's retribution into his own defensive power, strengthening the space around him to a certain limit. It was about to surpass the limits of the vast thousand world. However, under the endless attacks from the heaven's retribution, it was still on the verge of collapsing. How did it become so powerful all of a sudden? Broken Era was still unable to react. Everything was going so smoothly before. He resisted every attack from the heaven's retribution and absorbed the power contained in each attack to strengthen the space-time he created. He tried his best to improve the space-time's defensive and offensive capabilities, allowing him to deal with the next wave of attacks with ease. However, he did not expect the heaven's retribution to suddenly change as if it was stimulated by something. The intensity of the attacks was no longer the same as before. Instead, it kept increasing in strength and sublimation. Originally, it would take dozens of waves of attacks to complete, but this time, it was not even comparable to a single attack. After a few more attacks, he was obviously exhausted and could no longer put up an effective resistance. Just like at this moment, although the world around him was vast and powerful, the boundless lightning directly enveloped the world. Countless strange creatures that were far beyond the imagination of this world evolved. Attacks and divine abilities constantly pounced on the world, causing more and more damage to the world. These changes were so unfamiliar to the broken world, but to Luo Fan, who was watching from the void, it couldn't be any more familiar. The thunderbolts gave birth to all kinds of creatures, attacks, and skills that he had created. In other words, this was clearly the space that had plundered everything contained in his fragments and converted them into attacks from the heaven's retribution to deal with Broken Era. Seeing this, Luo Fan felt helpless and happy. He felt helpless because the heaven's retribution was using him. Although the fragments were shattered by the space, they were still a part of him. Now that the heaven's retribution had dug out everything contained in the fragments, didn't that mean that a part of him had been dug out by the heaven's retribution? How could he not feel helpless? Needless to say, he was overjoyed because the heavenly tribulation would have to go through his fragments in order to use the secrets he had dug out from his fragments. As such, all Duan Shiji needed to do was block the attack and shatter it. That way, he would be able to obtain more fragments that were dozens of times or even hundreds of times more than before. This was naturally something to be happy about. Although it's a little difficult, it's still not a problem. After careful consideration, Luo Fan was relieved. Duan Shiji might suffer a little from this attack and suffer some losses, but he would still be able to block it in the end. As expected, after holding on for a while, The world around Duan Shi's body was torn into countless pieces. His body had also shattered several times. However, in the end, he still managed to block this attack. In the end, he still relied on his final eruption to completely destroy the surrounding boundless thunderbolts, causing the countless fragments that belonged to Luo Fan to finally be completely diluted. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Luo Fan quickly summoned the fragments and fused them into his body, bringing him one step closer to perfection. I'll be truly perfect after another 100 attacks like this. Feeling the improvement of his essence, Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of anticipation. Originally, he might have needed tens of thousands of attacks to reach perfection. However, with the current increase of the heavenly tribulation, he would be able to recover all of his fragments after just 100 more attacks. He would be able to make his fragments in this world complete and reach true perfection. At that moment, Duan Shiji kept praying that the attack would not appear again. He raised his head to look at the sky and the tribulation clouds that looked like black holes. An inexplicable sense of helplessness surged from the bottom of his heart. One should know that his previous world was formed by fusing the power of countless attacks into one spot. However, such a power had been so weak under the previous wave of attack from the heavenly tribulation and had been destroyed so easily. If it were to come a few more times, it would be hard to say whether it would still be able to leave a mark on it. I'll have to say goodbye to my teacher forever if this happens another 3 to 5 times. Duan Shiji thought to himself with a bitter smile on his face. However, despite feeling so powerless, he did not slow down at all. At this moment, he was still trying his best to gather the power that belonged to the heavenly tribulation in his surroundings. He tried his best to gather it around his body to reconstruct his defensive ability. This time, he no longer used the method of the world to construct his divine ability. Instead, he used an extremely pure defensive method to construct his divine ability. After all, although the world was all-encompassing and contained all imaginable and unimaginable powers, it was precisely because it was all-encompassing that it could not reach its limit in any aspect. This was the most suitable choice for him when he was dealing with the heavenly tribulation with ease and had to deal with the myriad of attacks that the heavenly tribulation could produce. However, at this moment, the pressure that he was enduring had almost exceeded his limit. In a situation where he might die if he was careless, this was the most foolish choice. It was precisely because of this that he chose the purest defensive ability to construct his divine ability. As he constructed his divine ability, a layer of light that was as pure as flowing water appeared around his body. It filled a radius of several meters around him, completely isolating his body from the outside world. No power, divine ability, or impact from the outside world could pass through this layer of light and approach him. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the sky began to churn. An unimaginable pressure began to descend from the tribulation clouds. Even if the tribulation clouds were born from the world, the pressure had already exceeded the limit that the world could bear. It caused the space within the tribulation clouds to violently distort. Amidst this distortion, time, space, matter, energy, laws, and everything else seemed to be thrown into an indescribable state of chaos. The chaos was so intense that it even gradually isolated the area from the outside world. It was as if the area had returned to a state of chaos. In the face of such a change, the pure light around Duan Shi's body began to distort violently, as if it was under the greatest pressure. Faint cracks began to appear on the light, as if it was about to shatter. At this moment, Duan Shi felt an unimaginable fear rising from the bottom of his heart. In a trance, he seemed to have returned to the last moment of his previous life when he stepped into the reincarnation cycle. He once again felt the fear of his body collapsing and being destroyed. What's going on? Is the entire world's energy pouring towards me? At this moment, such an unbelievable thought emerged from the bottom of Duan Shi's heart. Along with this thought, there was also the most profound despair. At this moment, The tribulation clouds in the sky that were like black holes began to distort. Their original pitch-black luster began to dissipate. Various colors that were different from black began to appear in the tribulation clouds. Not long after, the tribulation clouds turned into a human figure. It was an extremely tall and majestic figure that seemed to suppress the void of the universe and the boundless chaos just by standing there. It was a figure that looked extremely similar to the appearance that Luo Fan had turned into in this world. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace that was in between reality and illusion, could not help but exclaim 100 times. He could tell that the figure was none other than the condensation of all the energy in the heavenly tribulation. The image that was condensed was completely extracted from his fragments. It was an image that could maximize the power of the fragments. It was his image. The power was more than 100 times stronger than the previous wave of tribulations that Duan Shi had encountered. In other words, if Duan Shi could withstand this attack, Luo Fan would no longer need to wait for the other waves of attacks from the heavenly tribulation. All he needed to do was to collect all the fragments contained in this wave of attacks. Then, he would be able to retrieve all the fragments that he had previously scattered and regain his full power. However, the premise was that Duan Shi could withstand this attack. One must know that Duan Shi had barely managed to withstand the previous wave of attacks. He had even paid a huge price by shattering his body several times in order to withstand the attacks. However, this wave of attacks was more than 100 times stronger than the previous wave. The chances of Duan Shi being able to withstand were extremely slim. In fact, it was almost impossible at this moment. Even Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of helplessness from the bottom of his heart. What a pity. It seems like there's no way for me to regain my full power this time. The thought appeared in his mind at this moment, causing his expression to gradually turn disappointed. At this moment, Duan Shi's body and mind were already in shock. He could only raise his head to look at the figure that appeared above him. It was the figure that he was extremely familiar with and admired. "Master," he murmured. The despair in his heart had become unprecedentedly strong. One must know that he was confident that he was a dragon among men and the strongest existence in this world. He believed that all living beings and cultivators in this world were no match for him and could not even stand on the same level as him. However, deep down in his heart, he knew very well that he was still too far away from his master. If he was one, then his master would be 100 million, 1 billion, or even 10 billion. No matter how much he had improved, no matter how many times he had grown, compared to his teacher, he was still an insignificant ant. Under such circumstances, he did not have the slightest will to fight when he faced Luo Fan. Originally, he only had admiration, respect, obedience, and worship when he faced the real Luo Fan. However, now that he was facing the Luo Fan that was formed by the heavenly tribulation, the Luo Fan that was his enemy, all he felt was fear and despair. At this moment, the Luo Fan that was formed by the heavenly tribulation's energy began to slowly descend. Step by step, it was as if Duan Shi was getting closer to heaven and earth. With every step that Luo Fan took, Duan Shi felt the pressure on him increase by several times. As for the pure brilliance that was formed by the boundless energy around him, it kept cracking under the pressure. In just 3 steps, the brilliance had completely collapsed. Duan Shi could only face the extremely terrifying pressure that was enough to completely crush heaven and earth. Duan Shi's body was creaking in the face of such pressure. Cracks kept appearing on his body and penetrated deep into the core of his body, into his life source, and even into the depths of his life imprint. As expected of my master, at this moment, Duan Shi was not worried about his life. Instead, he lamented. He knew that Luo Fan was powerful, and he knew that he was just an ant compared to Luo Fan. However, it was only now that he truly felt how powerful Luo Fan was. How terrifying was the gap between him and Luo Fan in the end? I can't even bear Master's aura. What a pity that I can't sit down and listen to Master's lecture like before. As he thought of this, there was an indescribable sense of relief in the depths of his eyes. Although he was about to die and his soul was about to dissipate, there was a sense of relief in his heart. After all, in the final moments of his life, he finally understood just how powerful his teacher was. He understood just how vast and boundless the prospects of cultivation were. To him, this was a rare consolation. At the very least, compared to dying in the heavenly tribulation in a muddle-headed manner, dying in the destructive power, this death made him feel more comforted. At this moment, Luo Fan had unknowingly taken his 9th step. The distance between him and Duan Shi was still extremely far, but the terrifying pressure that was being emitted from his body was something that Duan Shi couldn't bear. At this moment, his body trembled under the terrifying pressure and collapsed in the blink of an eye. Chapter 23:49. As the cracks continued to deepen, Duan Shi felt an inexplicable sense of despair gradually emerging from the depths of his heart. This despair was so heavy that it felt as if a boundless world was pressing down on him. It caused the world in his eyes, the world in his senses, and everything in his memories to become dim and lose all meaning. In this despair, a subtle comprehension began to emerge from the depths of his heart. This comprehension started from this despair and continued to spread. The range it affected kept increasing, and in the end, it allowed him to obtain an indescribable sublimation. Under this sublimation, many of the problems he had in the past had all turned into common sense. The fog that had been obscuring his knowledge quickly dissipated. In a trance, he had already broken through an invisible boundary and stepped into a whole new world. This is triggering the essence of my body. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, sighed. At this moment, what happened to Duan Shi was none other than using this despair as a guide to trigger the cultivation achievement that came from his creation template that was contained in the essence of his life. This was a change that seemed to be resonating, but not at the same time. In that instant, Duan Shi's life imprint began to heal rapidly. As his life healed, so did his life origin, spirit, and finally, even his body. Boom! After his body was completely healed, a huge and unparalleled aura was wildly released from his body, colliding with the aura that Luo Fan had transmitted down from above. In an instant, a terrifying shock wave was produced, crazily spreading in all directions. It even cleared up the chaotic time, space, matter, energy, and even the laws of law in the surroundings. Despair. So this is what despair is. Duan Shi muttered at this moment. There seemed to be the deepest despair in the depths of his eyes, but there was also an inexplicable joy. At this moment, he had already understood that he had already broken through the false saint stage and had become a despaired one. It was precisely because he had become a despair one that he was able to slightly resist the aura released by Luo Fan, who was descending from the sky, and was able to struggle a little. However, it was obvious that it was only a little. Soon, as Luo Fan continued to descend from above, the aura emanating from his body became stronger and stronger, and the impact it produced became more and more terrifying. In just a few steps, the shockwave from the clash between Broken Era and the aura was completely suppressed. The pressure even broke through Broken Era's aura and pressed down on him again. However, compared to his previous state where his body would shatter under the pressure of the aura, Duan Shi's performance was much better. The rising power in his body was stimulated involuntarily at this moment. Boundless power continuously rushed towards his body in all directions, colliding with the pressure on his body. Although it was not enough to make the pressure collapse completely, it prevented most of the pressure's effect from reaching his body, allowing him to endure the pressure. He was actually able to block it for a short while. Looks like there's still a chance. At that moment, a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Various methods kept appearing in his mind at this moment, but he rejected them all. If he had enough time, he would definitely spend a lot of time to consider everything clearly, and in the end, he would choose the most perfect method to carry out. However, it was obvious that he did not have enough time at this moment. Even if he used the despair as a catalyst to stimulate the cultivation achievement that he copied from the template and became a despair, broken era was still insignificant compared to his fragment that was formed by the heavenly tribulation. It was foreseeable that if he delayed any longer, when the heavenly tribulation formed him arrived before broken era, he would not even need to make a move. Just his existence alone would be enough to completely wipe out broken era, and even his life imprint would collapse and disappear. With the speed of the figure formed by the heavenly tribulation, it would not take long for that to happen. In the end, Luo Fan secretly gritted his teeth. If I miss this chance, I'll probably have to wait for billions of years to find such a perfect opportunity again. I can only take a risk and give it a try. With that thought in mind, he withdrew all his attention and gathered all his telepathic senses into the depths of his body, into the essence of his life. Through this concentration, everything he sensed began to rapidly enlarge. In the blink of an eye, it had already filled the range of all his senses. Everything related to him also continued to enlarge, becoming clearer and clearer in his heart, becoming more and more obvious. In the end, he relied on the connection of his essence to sense a certain existence outside his body that had a broken connection with him. The moment he sensed the broken connection, he knew that he had found what he was looking for. Immediately, his eyes narrowed, and his power extended along this intermittent connection. Like a plant growing, he did his best to accelerate this connection, causing this originally intermittent connection to gradually stabilize. During this process, he felt an indescribable resistance acting on his power. Under this resistance, every inch his power advanced was like climbing a mountain with great difficulty while facing the endless pressure of the world. Every step seemed to consume his origin and burn himself. In fact, he could even faintly feel that the outside world seemed to produce a subtle tremor with every inch of his power. It was as if the entire world was being shaken by some invisible force. It was precisely because of these various strange feelings that Luo Fan was extremely confident that his choice was correct. Following this connection, he could indeed achieve his goal. However, at the same time, his heart was also gradually raised along with this change. This was because if this guess was correct, it meant that he was about to face an extremely terrifying backlash. It sounded complicated, but in fact the entire process even surpassed time. When Luo Fan finally completely connected the broken connection and his will descended on the existence that belonged to him through the connection, not even a second had passed in the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan realized that he no longer existed in the cosmic void inside his palace. Instead, he appeared in a place that looked extremely chaotic, as if he was in a state of chaos. At his feet, there was an extremely familiar figure who was looking at him with a complicated gaze. The power surged around his body, as if he had unleashed all his potential to resist the aura that he had unconsciously spread out. That familiar figure was naturally Duan Shi. Duan Shi's current body was condensed by the heavenly tribulation. It had his image, his power, and his might. It was Luo Fan. In other words, the current Luo Fan had basically taken over the heavenly tribulation and replaced it. In an instant, the entire world shook violently. Vaguely, an emotion that was close to anger surged in the void. Endless, terrifying pressure rapidly pressed down on the body of Luo Fan that was condensed by the heavenly tribulation. Even the chaos of time, space, matter, energy, and even laws could not withstand it. Under this pressure, they were quickly eliminated and smoothed out. Of course, the elimination and smoothing out of the chaos did not mean that the areas had returned to their original state. Instead, the areas were fixed and maintained the state before they were eliminated and smoothed out. It looked like someone had suddenly pressed the pause button and the original video screen had turned into a photo. I finally succeeded. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, the aura on his body suddenly withdrew. In the blink of an eye, the state that was originally enough to make Duan Shi, who was in despair, collapse physically and mentally, became invisible. Boom! power was surging around Duan Shi's body, almost stimulating all of his potential to resist the aura. However, the aura suddenly disappeared completely. The power that suppressed almost all of his potential disappeared completely, causing the power, aura, and potential in his body to instantly rush out of his body. It directly destroyed the surrounding time and space, producing a terrifying impact that spread wildly in all directions. At this moment, the pressure that gathered from all directions was clearly focused on Luo Fan, who was above. Clearly, it did not care about the destruction of the world at all. It allowed Lin Sheng's strength, might, and potential to easily break through it, causing the chaos in the surroundings to be instantly broken apart, revealing a wider and wider region of vacuum. What's going on? At this moment, Duan Shi finally reacted to the change in the situation. He could not help but look around in surprise. In the end, he focused his attention on the power of the heavenly tribulation that had his teacher's image and strength. The moment he saw the figure, he was stunned. This was because he suddenly realized that the original coldness and unfamiliarity of the figure had completely disappeared. It was replaced by calmness and familiarity. Teacher, with the appearance of this feeling, he instantly understood. Wasn't the person in front of him his teacher? It was not a teacher who only had an image, only power, but no will. It was a real teacher. At this moment, his mind became extremely chaotic. He even forgot to retract the enormous power and strength that he had released. He let the power and strength continue to spread in all directions, constantly shaking the space-time that was getting wider and wider. At this moment, most of the world could instantly feel the shocking turbulence that was spreading from this area. Facing such a change, countless living beings were inexplicably shocked. As for the 3,000 cultivators who were the supreme commanders of the entire world in the depths of the space-time, they were even more shocked and frightened. The appearance of the turbulence made them feel that all the worries that they had previously had seemed to be coming true. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a long breath. He looked up at the sky and felt the terrifying pressure that was coming at him from all directions. He felt relaxed. Although such a change was fatal to ordinary cultivators, and even Duan Shiji, it was enough to kill them without any chance of survival. However, it was just a small trouble for him. At least, the worst outcome that he had expected did not happen. At this moment, he even had the time to smile at Duan Shi and said, "Why aren't you retracting your power? Do you want to face the calamity yourself?" The words were spoken in a leisurely manner. When they entered Duan Shi's ears, he was awakened from his daze. He was finally certain that the figure in front of him was his teacher. "Thank you, teacher, for taking the risk to save me. If it weren't for you, I would have died a terrible death." At this moment, Duan Shi was enlightened. While he retracted his power and strength, he knelt at Luo Fan and thanked him. Luo Fan smiled and said, "I'm just doing it for myself. What happened here has nothing to do with you anymore. Leave now." Duan Shi hesitated for a moment before he said, I was the one who caused this. How can I just leave and leave the mess to you?" Luo Fan scolded with a smile. "What can you do even if you stay here with your current strength? You're just a burden. I might even need to spare some of my power to protect you. Just go, don't waste my time." Duan Shi blushed when he heard Luo Fan's words. If it was someone else who said that to him, he would naturally refute it no matter what. However, the person who said that was his teacher, the person who could suppress him to the point that he couldn't move with just his aura and even almost turned him into ashes. For such an existence to give him such an evaluation, what else could he do but accept it? Not to mention, his heart was filled with reverence for Luo Fan. Even if it was an unreasonable evaluation, he would still honestly accept it. Therefore, he could only bow in shame and say, "If that's the case, I'll take my leave. I wish you all the best, teacher." Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand. Duan Shi stood up and turned into a ray of light. He dashed toward the tribulations area within a radius of a few 100,000 li. With his speed, he crossed the distance in the blink of an eye and disappeared into the horizon. Fortunately, the heavenly tribulation no longer cared about him. Otherwise, Just its aura alone would be enough to turn the boundary of this region into an eternal barrier that could not be broken, completely imprisoning him in this region. Chapter 2350. Faced with this power, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes. Although the current situation was much better than the worst-case scenario, it was still the backlash of the world. Even if it wasn't that bad, it wasn't easy. In that instant, trillions of changes took place in his body. If Duan sure saw any of these changes, it would be enough for him to comprehend the most profound secrets and even break through the shackles of cultivation, allowing his cultivation to make an unimaginable breakthrough. However, at this moment, such a change occurred in his body in the trillions of times. Amidst all these changes, the might in his body, his power, and his abilities all produced all sorts of mysterious and subtle changes. They naturally combined into various means to counter the countless powers that were attacking his body and directly collided with those powers. For a moment, Luo Fan's body seemed to have suddenly given birth to an infinite space-time, an infinite heaven and earth, which forcibly swallowed this infinite power. Not even the slightest trace of it was revealed. That kind of intense eruption that should have existed didn't exist at all. It was as if everything had been swallowed up by him. In that instant, the world was enraged. The space-time within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers instantly collapsed. Chaos that was even more terrifying than the battle between Heaven's Retribution and Duan Shi instantly spread out. In the blink of an eye, the place turned into a hazy state of absolute chaos. The pressure that came from all directions and acted on Luo Fan's body instantly skyrocketed by who knew how many times. The thing that caused this area to become so chaotic was obviously this pressure. The terror of this pressure was self-evident. At this moment, Luo Fan even felt as if he had been fixed in the void. Even his body's mobility had been greatly restricted. It felt as if even breathing had consumed a large portion of his strength at this time. In the face of this terrible situation, Luo Fan's expression became a little more relaxed than before. Specks of spiritual light were released from the depths of his body and continuously seeped into the pressure acting on him. They gradually disintegrated the pressure and allowed his body and mind to regain their original freedom. One must know that although the pressure was terrifyingly powerful and could even directly destroy the surrounding space-time and turn this place into a state of chaos again, it was still pressure in the end. As pressure, it was naturally limited by the essence of power. In other words, it was singular. It wasn't difficult for those who understood its characteristics to bypass this single characteristic. Of course, there was a precondition for this, and that was that the level of the power had to be within the scope of the target's tolerance. If the power exceeded the limit and could even destroy the universe and break the state of chaos, it would be useless no matter how much the cultivator knew about the characteristics of this power. However, it was clear that the terrifying pressure acting on Luo Fan's body at this time obviously didn't exceed Luo Fan's endurance limit. Therefore, at this moment, he could use the spiritual light that contained his own concept to bypass the pressure and eliminate the effect of the pressure on him. The pressure was the carrier of the world's backlash, so it naturally could not be so simple. At this moment, stimulated by the spiritual light that Luo Fan released, it also produced a corresponding change. In an instant, the great Tao in the dark began to tremble. All sorts of indescribable power was produced from the great Tao and began to penetrate through all sorts of indescribable channels. It quickly rushed towards the spiritual light that dispelled the pressure and collided with the spiritual light, resulting in an earth-shattering reaction. All sorts of indescribable power was born from the point of collision and continued to spread in all directions in the form of shock waves, causing the already chaotic surroundings to become even more chaotic. Vaguely, Luo Fan even felt that the existences that corresponded to him on other planes seemed to be enduring some kind of impact from the outside world. At this moment, they seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Faced with this power that was directly released from the great Tao, Luo Fan knew that he could not delay any longer. The attack this time was already thousands of times stronger than before. It could be predicted that if the situation continued to develop like this, then the next wave of attacks would probably cause quite a bit of trouble for him. After thinking this through, he no longer hesitated and instantly attracted the light of heaven and earth. A mysterious impact instantly erupted from his body and swept across the entire world, causing the entire world to suddenly stop at this moment. It was as if time was completely stuck at this moment, and the entire world was in a fixed state. At this moment, among the living beings in the world, there were those who were extremely sensitive to the world. In other words, they were cultivators who were in a state that was close to being one with the world. However, they suddenly felt a strange feeling that almost overturned their worldview. That was blankness. It was not their own blankness, but the entire world had suddenly become blankness. It was as if something that the world could not understand and imagine had suddenly appeared in front of them, forcing them to understand and imagine it. The source of this change was none other than the power of the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had attracted. After all, the light of heaven and earth was a mysterious light that contained the will of the world. Now that the power of the light of heaven and earth had been attracted, it was naturally impossible for the will of the world to remain still. The appearance of this situation was not because of anything else, but because the will of the world had been interfered with by the will of the world contained in the light of heaven and earth, and had temporarily fallen into a state of chaos. The blankness that the cultivators who were one with the world sensed was the manifestation of this state of chaos. This kind of chaos caused the endless pressure around Luo Fan's body to suddenly pause. This pause did not cause the pressure to disappear, nor did it cause the destructive power that was released from the great Tao that passed through the pressure to disappear. However, it made them all stiffen up. When facing an existence at the level of Luo Fan, being stiff was the most fatal mistake. At this moment, his heart only moved slightly, but he had already seen the tiny flaws in the power and power. Immediately after, boundless spiritual light burst out of his body and turned into countless thin lines that poured into the surrounding pressure. In the blink of an eye, it had already densely covered the chaotic region that spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Then, before the will of the world digested the impact of the will of the world contained in the light of heaven and earth and recovered, these spiritual lights flashed wildly. When everything calmed down, Luo Fan's body had already disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared. Only the countless spiritual lights that still filled the region that spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers were left, enduring the anger of the world and withstanding the impact of the power and power of the world that had recovered. In the end, it completely collapsed and turned into nothingness, as if it had never existed. I finally succeeded. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace that was in between reality and illusion, let out a long sigh. At this moment, there was another Luo Fan in front of him. This was the Luo Fan that he had forcibly taken from the heavenly tribulation and was condensed from the power of the heavenly tribulation. Clearly, Luo Fan had taken advantage of the moment when the will of the world was in a state of chaos to keep this body, avoiding all the detection from the outside world and also avoiding the influence of the power of the heavenly tribulation. Then what are you waiting for? The Luo Fan that was condensed from the power of the heavenly tribulation said faintly. Then his body gradually began to emit light as if a shocking light source was absorbed into his body. At this moment, it was releasing its own light and heat crazily. This body was condensed from the heavenly tribulation. It looked no different from Luo Fan, but in fact there were still some differences. In fact, the difference between it and Luo Fan was similar to the difference between Duan Shi and the true sage who could resonate with him. In other words, Luo Fan seemed to be able to completely control this body, and it seemed like he had almost completely turned this body into his clone or incarnation. However, that was only on the surface. In essence, he was still fundamentally different from a clone or incarnation. The reason why Luo Fan was still able to achieve this step and turn this body into a clone and an incarnation despite the difference in essence was actually very simple. That was, he had directly usurped the control of the body through the resonance in essence, and completely erased the will that was originally given by the heavenly tribulation in the body. That's right, this resonance was the kind that occurred between Duan Shi and the true sage previously. However, compared to the resonance between Duan Shi and the true sage, the resonance between Luo Fan and the true sage that was condensed from the heaven's retribution was much stronger. Not only was he able to transmit information, but he could also transmit his will, which allowed him to achieve that kind of possession. It was precisely because of the difference between the two that Luo Fan couldn't easily take it back in his body like he did with his clone. Instead, he needed to first disintegrate it, then refine his own fragments. Only then could he complete the process of taking back all the fragments. There was a vast starry sky in the palace that Luo Fan was in. Naturally, there was enough space for him to do whatever he wanted. At this moment, endless light and heat were released from the body of Luo Fan that was condensed from the heavenly tribulation. It gradually melted the surrounding space-time and quickly erased the chaos that was originally caused by Duan Shi, replacing everything in the surroundings with light and heat. In the end, there was a loud rumble and boundless shockwaves erupted, completely shattering the starry sky within the hall. In the blink of an eye, the place seemed to have returned to a state of chaos, and a dusky luster appeared. All matter, all power, and even time and space itself were completely mixed together under the shockwaves. However, all these changes did not affect Luo Fan, who was sitting in the middle of the starry sky. At this moment, his expression didn't even change because of this. The impact that could turn the universe back into primal chaos was almost as insignificant as a breeze to him. It didn't even lift the corners of his clothes in the slightest. At this moment, the fragments, along with the endless impact, surged in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had filled the entire palace, just like the endless stars that originally existed in the starry sky of the universe. These fragments belonged to Luo Fan, and they contained his essence. In the starry sky of the universe that Luo Fan had opened up, they had supreme authority. At this moment, they covered the starry sky of the universe and naturally guided the energy, matter, time, and space in it to continuously gather and mend, forming stars with them as the core. It could be predicted that if Luo Fan did not pay attention to them, they would definitely become the core of the new stars in the starry sky of the universe. In the end, the starry sky would obtain a new order. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan had spent so much effort to retrieve these fragments. How could he ignore them at this moment? At this moment, he did not move at all, but his body naturally emitted an unimaginable suction force that accurately locked onto the countless fragments in the chaotic starry sky of the universe. Under the suction force, the fragments began to rapidly shoot towards him from all directions, leaving behind extremely dazzling traces in the boundless chaos. They gathered on his body and rushed straight into his body. As the countless fragments fused with him, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of completion from the bottom of his heart. His cultivation realm also began to rise crazily. In the blink of an eye, he had already surpassed the limit of a first tribulation expert and directly entered the level of a second tribulation expert. Following this, he directly broke through the limit of a second tribulation expert and entered the level of a third tribulation expert. At this moment, this breakthrough gradually slowed down and finally stopped when he was about to reach the peak of a third tribulation expert. Feeling the satisfaction from the bottom of his heart after breaking through, Luo Fan showed a faint smile on his face. To him, who was currently challenging the sixth tribulation expert, being a third tribulation expert was naturally far from his peak. However, compared to before, his improvement was so great that it had already surpassed the limits of the imagination of all living beings in this world. With such an improvement, many of his previous plans could already be carried out. He was no longer as powerless against this world as before and could only continue to hide. Chapter 2351. While Luo Fan was deep in thought, this place that was in between reality and illusion was subtly touched. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that someone was trying to enter this place. He focused his gaze and saw that person in the blink of an eye. It was Duan Shi. Of course, in fact, he was the only one who could do it. After all, apart from him, no other existence in this world could find this place, let alone try to enter it. Of course, even Duan Shi could only give it a try. Luo Fan was the one who would decide whether he could enter this place or not at this moment. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he had already eliminated the obstruction of the existence that existed between reality and illusion. Duan Shi felt his vision become empty, and he had already arrived in front of the palace that he yearned for. When he felt the change in the resistance, he let out a sigh of relief. Obviously, this change meant that the owner of this place still existed. It also meant that the worst situation that he was worried about did not happen. At this moment, the door of the hall opened and a mysterious scene began to appear in front of him. It was the process of chaos being split open by a strange, invisible force. The boundless grayness was constantly condensing, dispersing, transforming, and changing in an incomparably natural way. In the end, it gradually turned into a starry sky that was getting clearer and clearer. With Duan Shi's eyesight, he could even see that there were lives rapidly being born in the endless stars. All these changes seemed to have transcended time. When Duan Shi saw everything clearly, everything seemed to have passed. The interior of the hall had returned to the vast starry sky that he was most familiar with. However, this feeling was completely overturned the moment he stepped into the hall. This was because he suddenly realized that the hall was no longer the same as before. This was an earth-shattering change. The moment he stepped into the hall, an incomparably ancient and vicissitude aura hit him in the face. It made him feel that he did not step into a starry sky that had just been born. On the contrary, he felt like he had stepped into an ancient place that had billions of years of history and had gone through countless tribulations. Just this moment alone made him understand that the foundation of this starry sky in front of him had already been fundamentally improved compared to the last time he saw it. As expected of teacher, even when facing the heavens and earth, he's still able to obtain a lot of benefits. Duan Shi lamented. With this thought in mind, he had already arrived before Luo Fan, who was at the center of the universe. Although the universe was vast and boundless with a radius of hundreds of millions of light years, for Duan Shi, who had already surpassed the Fall Saint stage, it was clearly not much different from an ordinary hall. He only needed 1 or 2 steps to cross the distance of hundreds of millions of light years and directly arrive at the center of the universe. When he saw Luo Fan, all the distracting thoughts from before disappeared in an instant, replaced by boundless gratitude and joy. He couldn't help but kneel down and feel deeply grateful to Luo Fan. Obviously, Luo Fan didn't care about Duan Shi's gratitude. He just said, "This matter is also of great benefit to me. You don't have to worry about it. No matter what teacher's plan is, your kindness to me is real. I won't dare to ignore it," Duan Shi said with extreme determination. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally couldn't be bothered to say anything more. He just said, "Let's not talk about him for now. Let's talk about your problem now. You felt it too, right? Just now, at the last moment of the tribulation, you already felt him, right?" Duan Shi's expression suddenly changed when he heard this. He said, "Teacher, are you talking about the existence that I came into contact with in despair? As expected, I still can't get rid of him in the end." Luo Fan sighed. Actually, Luo Fan still had some feelings for Duan Shi in front of him. After all, he wasn't cold-hearted. Even if his temperament was perfect, it didn't mean that he didn't have any emotions. It was impossible for him to not care about someone who respected him so much that even at the last moment of his life, he didn't want to serve him in front of him anymore. Due to these feelings, he couldn't completely ignore Duan Shi's experience. He couldn't just sit back and watch Duan Shi fall into the fate that he hated the most. "What is that? Teacher, please teach me." Duan Shi hurriedly bowed down and shouted. Although in the end, he had relied on the despair to stimulate his potential and become a hopeless person, only then was he able to struggle out of the heavenly tribulation and survive. that kind of breakthrough and the benefits were too strange for him. It was so strange that he couldn't help but recall his experience in his past life. He recalled the true saint who seemed to be able to resonate with him. At this moment, when Luo Fan mentioned it, he began to worry. He was worried that he would fall into the tragedy of his past life again. Luo Fan smiled and said, "Don't worry too much. Although it's a little dangerous, it's not inevitable. Your current situation is fundamentally different from before." Duan Shi let out a sigh of relief when he heard that. However, he still couldn't relax completely. After all, although he trusted Luo Fan and understood that Luo Fan said that it was different from before, it must be different. However, Luo Fan hadn't fully explained what was going on. Moreover, judging from his words, it wasn't that there was no problem, but it wasn't a big problem. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "This heaven and earth isn't the real heaven and earth. It's just a replica." Duan Shi's mind was instantly shaken to the point where he almost collapsed like a bolt of lightning. He was instantly dumbfounded. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Although Luo Fan had revealed some information to him in his past life, it was obvious that Duan Shi had completely forgotten about it. At this moment, when he heard this, he felt that it was no different from someone who had not received any information at all. At this moment, he wanted to deny it. However, his trust in Luo Fan eventually won him over, so he directly eliminated the thought of denying it. Just like that, his expression kept changing. After a while, he gradually came back to his senses and said, "I've lost my composure. Please forgive me, Master. I'm a little disappointed that you trust me so much." Luo Fan sighed. If he had no feelings for Duan Shi, the more blind Duan Shi was to him, the happier he would be. However, since he had some feelings for Duan Shi, even if it wasn't deep, he felt inexplicably disappointed to be so blind to Duan Shi. After all, blindness was the biggest enemy of a cultivator's cultivation. Blindness towards any existence, even blind trust towards a true sage, was a fatal weakness. That was because blindness represented dependence. Dependence represented a lack of confidence in oneself. Without confidence, it meant that one would never have the chance to become a true saint. Becoming a true saint meant that one would replace the perfect heaven and earth with everything he had. What kind of unbelievable feat was that? Without a heaven-defying belief and an incomparably firm self, how could one succeed? Without confidence, it was obvious that one's self was not firm enough, and one's belief was not firm enough. Of course, it was impossible for one to succeed. Hearing this, Duan Shi could not help but blush. He said, "I've let you down, Master." Looking at his reaction, Luo Fan naturally knew that he had no intention of changing his mind. He could only smile bitterly to himself. "You'll have to pay attention to this matter in the future. It won't be good to change it by force." That was all he said to Duan Shi at that moment. After that, he changed the topic and said, "Since you already believe that this heaven and earth is some kind of clone, it's easy to deal with it. Since even the heaven and earth are clones, everything in this heaven and earth naturally has a template." When Duan Shi came back to his senses, his expression changed abruptly. At that moment, he finally understood what Luo Fan was trying to say. If everything in this heaven and earth had a template, then what about him? Disciple's template, he said in shock. "That's right. Your template is the true saint who can always resonate with you," Luo Fan said. Hearing this, Duan Shi was slightly stunned. However, compared to his previous life, he had made great progress. This time, he did not completely break down and die like in his previous life. Instead, his soul was shaken and his realm was slightly unstable. Regarding this, Luo Fan did not forcefully suppress his aura and maintain his realm. Instead, he waited quietly for his aura to naturally stabilize. As he waited, his emotions gradually calmed down. Being injured was not a big deal to someone at Duan Shi's level. No matter how serious the injury was, as long as he still had his consciousness, he would definitely be able to find a way to solve it. Even if he could not think of a way, there was still Luo Fan. Since he had such confidence, he naturally did not care how serious the injury would be. As long as Duan Shi's soul did not break down and he did not die, it was fine. After a while, Duansher gradually calmed down. At this time, the aura on his body had weakened by many times. It felt as if he had fallen to a state between a false saint and a person in despair. However, at least his realm did not completely drop. Not bad. You finally made progress. In your previous life, you had a mental breakdown after hearing this news and reincarnated. Luo Fan said to Duansher. Hearing the praise, Duansher smiled bitterly and said, "Although I'm still alive, I'm only left with half of my life. Since you're so open-minded, I believe you don't need me to tell you what's the self and what's the truth. The information you received at the last moment of the Heaven's tribulation was to stimulate the remaining potential in the template that you copied from the true saint. To a certain extent, this kind of potential isn't a bad thing. As long as your path of cultivation is the same as the true saint and there's no difference," Luo Fan said calmly. Hearing this, Duansher nodded. As for what Luo Fan was talking about, what was self and what was truth, he had naturally experienced a struggle. After all, no matter what, he was still in existence above the false saint stage. Such an existence could generate billions of thoughts and ideas in an instant. It could be said that in that instant, he had already considered his entire life over and over again for an unknown number of times. Naturally, he had already thought clearly about the problem of his self and his truth. What he cared about was what Luo Fan said, the extremely vast potential hidden in the depths of his life that pushed him to break through at the last moment of the Heaven's tribulation. Although he had only come into contact with that kind of potential, he was already shocked. One must know that he had only come into contact with it slightly before, and he had already made such a huge improvement. If he could fully stimulate this potential in the end, how terrifying would the improvement be? However, whether it was his own feelings or Luo Fan's attitude, it showed that this kind of potential was not a good thing for him. If he really accepted this kind of potential without reservation, he would probably regret it in the end, which is why he could not fully accept this kind of potential. At this moment, after hearing Luo Fan's words, he finally understood the hidden dangers of this potential. If I really accept this potential without reservation, I'm afraid that I'll gradually become an existence that's no different from that true saint. In the end, I might obtain supreme divine powers and rise to an unimaginable level. However, that might no longer be me, but some kind of incarnation of that true saint. At that moment, he broke out in cold sweat and felt as if he had just brushed shoulders with death. "Thank you for your guidance, Master. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I wouldn't even know that I've fallen into the trap." Duansher immediately thanked Luo Fan. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "You've now implemented your initial self and slightly separated yourself from your own destiny. In the future, you have to stick to it. Don't be greedy for a moment of pleasure that will lead to regret in the future." "Yes, Master," Duansher quickly said. Luo Fan nodded and immediately stopped talking about this topic. Instead, he began to guide Duansher on his cultivation. With Luo Fan's careful guidance, Duansher felt that an extremely vast world had opened up in front of him. His cultivation realm began to rise bit by bit in the process. In a trance, he had already crossed the bottleneck between the false saint stage and the desperation stage, and entered the desperation stage again. Moreover, compared to before, he was 30% stronger this time. His control of this realm was completely incomparable to before. Chapter 2352. Luo Fan looked at the harmonious aura emitted from Duansher's body from above and was secretly gratified. Although the realm that Duansher obtained from the Heaven's tribulation was not directly imparted to him, it was still something that came from a kind of resonance. Under such circumstances, the true saint's influence must be extremely great. Compared to Duansher's own cultivation path, there was a slight difference. Such a difference would have a huge impact on one's cultivation path. It would determine whether Duansher would develop into an alternative incarnation of the true saint or become an independent cultivator. The reason why Luo Fan spent so much effort to let Duansher's realm regress and re-enter the new realm was to make up for the difference. He wanted Duan to re-enter the despaired realm with his own cultivation path. He wanted to truly obtain the cultivation path of the despaired realm that belonged solely to him. Obviously, Duanshi's current performance had met Luo fans' expectations. You just broken through. You should stabilize your realm first. You don't have to worry about anything that happens in heaven and earth, Luo fan said to Duanshi. Duanshi was slightly stunned when he heard that. He knew that Luo fan was being considerate of him, so he quickly responded. Then, Luo fan did not stay any longer. He waved his hand and asked Duanshi to leave. He then went to open up a dojo to cultivate. In the past, he asked Duanshi to stay here to cultivate because Duanshi's strength was not strong enough. If he left, he might accidentally fall into the influence of the true saint's traces again. Now that Duanshi could walk between heaven and earth for so many years without being affected, and he had even walked out of his own cultivation path, there was no need for him to worry about it anymore. Duanshi naturally could not reject Luo fan's request. After bowing to Luo fan, he turned around and left the hall. After leaving the hall, he was naturally expelled from the place that was in between reality and illusion. He returned to the normal heaven and earth. After returning to this place, he didn't hesitate and directly entered the depths of space-time. He pushed aside the layers of laws and opened up a palace in the void between the layers of laws and the unseen laws and laws. This hall looked much simpler and smaller than Luo fan's hall. However, it was also extremely mysterious, possessing an incomparably powerful presence in the void. It stood there like a world of its own, giving off a feeling that it encompassed everything. Duanshi could not help but feel slightly disappointed after the palace was opened up. Compared to his own teacher's hall, this hall was still far too inferior. If it was opened by his teacher, the palace would be at least 10,000 times more profound than this. Of course, this feeling did not linger in his heart for too long. After all, it was only natural that he couldn't compare to his teacher. If he could, he would be extremely surprised. Immediately, he entered the palace and began the longest cultivation session since he was born. After Duanshi left, Luo fan did not stay in his hall for a moment. After sensing the outside world for a while, he discovered that the outside world had completely returned to normal. He could not help but smile faintly. In a flash, he disappeared from the palace and directly appeared in the outside world. After arriving here, the whole world faintly trembled. However, the trembling was extremely weak and lasted for a very short time. It almost made people think that it was just an illusion. Feeling such a movement, Luo fan knew in his heart that his previous conjecture had been confirmed. As expected, after he collected all the fragment from the outside world, the world could no longer easily lock onto him. Although he had expected it, when he confirmed it, Luo fan still felt a little relieved. He could not help but shake his head and laugh. In the end, he could not help but feel lucky. However, he did not reject this kind of wishful thinking. Instead, he carefully savored the various feelings brought about by this kind of thinking. After all, it had been a very long time since he had felt such ordinary emotions. As he savored the various emotions, he leisurely walked around the world. He was currently a third tribulation powerhouse. At this stage, even Duanshi, the strongest powerhouse in the world apart from him, was not worthy of a glance from him. As a result, as long as he didn't want others to notice him and didn't want to cause any changes, then no cultivator or change in the world would be able to notice his existence, nor would they be affected by him. Therefore, even though he spent a few years traveling to every inch of the world, even going to the headquarters of the alliance formed by 3,000 cultivators, strolling around the palace that was built when Duanshi was still a great emperor, and staying in the deep abyss of the southwestern wildlands for a few months, not a single living being discovered his existence. Not a single living being felt that something was wrong because of this. For all living beings, the situation in the world was extremely normal over the past few years. Even if there were occasional conflicts and chaos, it seemed to be the result of the natural evolution of the rules of the world. They had no idea how many things Luo fan had done in the world over the past few years. That's right, Luo Fan did not just stroll around casually over the past few years. Over the past few years, he had prepared hundreds of millions of special arrangements for the world. Some of these arrangements were to help the world resist the tribulations, while some were to help the impending tribulations destroy the world, the two aspects intertwined, forming a structure that was like a seesaw. It made the situation in the world inexplicably strange, like a bucket of explosives that could ignite at any time and a bucket of water that was only separated by a thin film that could be broken with a poke. It could be predicted that with all these preparations, if the world encountered a tribulation, the duration of the tribulation and the way it would develop would probably depend on a single thought from Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan did not pay much attention to these arrangements. In other words, he didn't have much hope for the results he could achieve from these arrangements. He had set up these arrangements mostly to test the world, to test the various tribulations of the world, and even the final great tribulation of the world. After all, although he had stepped into the world for a long time, he had already been affected by the laws of the world from the very beginning. He had been forced to hide in the place that existed between reality and illusion. The various guesses, knowledge, and senses he had about the world were actually obtained through various indirect methods. He still did not have much understanding of the world. This time, it was not easy for him to walk freely in the world again. Naturally, he would not let go of such a good opportunity to increase his understanding of the world and the tribulations. Several years later, after Luo Fan finished setting up everything, he did not return to the place that existed between reality and illusion. Instead, he chose an extremely ordinary spot in the world and settled down. He pretended to be the most ordinary cultivator in the world and obediently completed the various cultivation tasks of a cultivator. In secret, he was constantly receiving feedback from the various arrangements he had set up in the world. Through the various results of the feedback, he deduced the truth of the world that he did not understand when he was in the place that existed between reality and illusion. Of course, because the tribulation had not yet arrived, he did not know much about the other thing that he wanted to understand, which was the tribulation. However, he was not anxious about this, as he already had enough time. After all, the tribulation would come in the end. Time slowly passed, and soon another tribulation descended. This time, the tribulation began in the abyss in the depths of the barren land in the southwest. On this day, a living being in the abyss suddenly had a sudden impulse and developed an extremely strong desire to destroy. This desire to destroy could not be suppressed at all. Even the Alliance Master, who was like the fusion of a wild boar and a python, could not calm him down at all. Just when everyone was at a loss, the creature let out an explosive roar and crushed a creature beside it. Then it charged into the sky with boundless ruthlessness and charged out of the abyss, starting to announce its existence to the entire world. Damn it! The Alliance Master was shocked and furious. Compared to other living beings, his mind was clearer and he was more intelligent. At this moment, he had already thought of many things and vaguely understood what was going on. At this moment, the extremely ancient old man, who was also the old man who said that the Alliance Master was favored by his natural enemy, let out a sigh. Time's up. I wonder how many of us will survive this time. As he sighed, his body began to slowly sink into the abyss, slowly approaching the boundary between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. At this moment, the Alliance Master noticed his actions and could not help but yell angrily, "Stop! Are you going to sit back and do nothing again? What can I do?" The old man looked up at the Alliance Master and met his incomparably resentful gaze. His eyes were still clear, without a trace of guilt or hesitation. There was only a matter-of-fact expression. "You have more experience than all of us. This is such a precious asset. Are you not going to contribute your strength?" The Alliance Master said angrily. If it was not for the fact that the old man was unfathomable, he would have already pounced forward and used his strength to express his thoughts. In a tribulation, experience is the most useless thing. If you believe in experience, then experience might kill you. Aren't you already clear about this? The old man continued to sink as he said so. At this moment, the other living beings finally reacted to what the Alliance Master and the old man were talking about. In an instant, their expressions changed drastically. Some of them were even affected by the shock in their minds, and the violence that they suppressed began to expand wildly. In the end, they directly erupted with power, severely injuring their companions, or rushing out of the abyss with the first living being. Seeing this, the Alliance Master was even more shocked and furious. Think about it carefully. Did you think that the favor of your natural enemy would only slightly develop your wisdom? After saying that, the old man's figure completely disappeared into the darkness, completely disappearing from the senses of all living beings. At this moment, the Alliance Master was stunned. The favor of my natural enemy. He muttered, his emotions in a mess. The short period of time before he became the Alliance Master resurfaced in the depths of his memory and began to unfold in his heart bit by bit. It was as if he had experienced that period of time again and recalled everything from back then. In a daze, he felt as if there was endless information emerging from the depths of his heart like his own inspiration. The information was so complicated and mysterious. From this information, he seemed to understand many things, but also seemed to understand nothing. After a while, when it came back to its senses, it discovered that many things that it couldn't see clearly before suddenly became very clear at this moment. The fog that had been covering it seemed to have completely dissipated at this moment. The tribulation, which was originally an extremely mysterious existence to him, actually became obvious at a glance. I see. I actually overlooked so many things before. He muttered with an indescribable sense of helplessness in his eyes. Amidst this helplessness, there was also a hint of confidence that should not have appeared. It was as if he had already tightly grasped the throat of fate during that short period of time when he was in a daze. This change in attitude instantly calmed the many living beings who had the mark of chaos creatures. No matter how it came about, their leader was confident enough to deal with the upcoming disaster. This was something that was extremely reassuring. The tribulation this time has begun again. This is a huge disaster for us, but it is also a huge opportunity, the Alliance Master said at this moment. His voice was extremely confident and loud. At this moment, even the most cowardly living beings could not help but be encouraged by this voice and naturally gave birth to a faint hope. What opportunity? We don't see any opportunity. What we see is only a disaster. Some living beings mustered up the courage to refute.